There are men who believe silence means consent. Duke Cassian Ashford was one of them. For 4 years, he ruled Blackthorne Manor with the same iron hand he used to control Parliament, never once questioning whether the woman sleeping in the chamber beside his had stopped breathing the moment she became his wife. Power, he believed, was the ability to take what you wanted while the world stood too afraid to tell you no. And for 4 years, that philosophy worked perfectly. Until the morning he walked into her room and found Evelyn calmly folding dresses into a leather suitcase, her hands steady, her eyes dry, and her wedding ring sitting on the mahogany dresser like a discarded receipt. That was the moment Cassian Ashford learned that some women don't scream when their hearts break. They simply pack their belongings and disappear into the winter dawn, leaving behind nothing but the ghost of warmth in a palace built entirely from ice. Stay with me through this story of ruin and redemption, because what happens when a man who has everything loses the one thing he never knew mattered will change how you see power, pride, and the quiet devastation of being loved by someone incapable of love. And when you reach the end, tell me if you think some betrayals are too deep to forgive. The first snowfall of winter arrived early that year, covering Blackthorne Manor in a blanket of white that made the estate look almost beautiful. Almost. Cassian stood in his study overlooking the frozen gardens, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand despite the early hour, watching servants clear the stone pathways with methodical precision. Everything in his world operated with that same cold efficiency. Contracts signed without hesitation, business rivals crushed without mercy, a wife maintained without affection. He drained the glass and set it down hard enough to make the decanter rattle. The door opened without a knock. His steward, Marcus, entered with the morning correspondence stacked neatly on a silver tray. "Your Grace, the letters from Parliament require immediate attention. Lord Brennan is pushing back on the trade agreement again." Cassian didn't turn from the window. "Let him push. He'll sign when he realizes I control every shipping route from here to the northern ports." Marcus hesitated, which was unusual. The steward had served the Ashford family for 30 years and rarely showed uncertainty. "There's another matter, Your Grace. The staff has noticed the Duchess hasn't requested breakfast for 3 mornings. Cassian finally turned, his expression carved from the same granite as the manor walls. "And? They're concerned she might be unwell. Then send for the physician if they're so worried. I have more important things to manage than my wife's appetite." Marcus bowed and retreated, leaving Cassian alone with his whiskey and his absolute certainty that control meant never having to explain yourself to anyone, including the woman who shared your name, but nothing else. He didn't think about Evelyn again until later that afternoon when he returned from a meeting with his lawyers. The house felt different somehow, though he couldn't identify why. The same portraits lined the walls. The same fires burned in the same fireplaces. The same servants moved through the same routines they'd performed for decades. But something had shifted, like a note played slightly off-key in an otherwise perfect symphony. He found himself walking toward Evelyn's chambers without consciously deciding to do so. Their marriage had never included the intimacy of shared rooms. She had her wing. He had his. They intersected at carefully scheduled dinners and mandatory public appearances where she played the role of Duchess with flawless precision while he played the role of a man too powerful to care what anyone thought about his private arrangements. Her door was ajar. He pushed it open and stopped. Evelyn stood with her back to him, folding a blue evening gown with slow, deliberate movements. A leather suitcase lay open on the bed, already half filled with neatly arranged clothing. Her chestnut hair was pulled into a simple braid, and she wore a traveling dress the color of charcoal. She didn't turn when he entered, didn't acknowledge his presence at all, just continued folding the gown with hands that never trembled. "What are you doing?" It wasn't a question. Cassian didn't ask questions. He issued statements and expected the world to reorganize itself accordingly. Evelyn placed the gown in the suitcase and reached for another dress. "Leaving." The single word hit him like a physical blow, though he'd never admit it. "Leaving where?" "Here. You. This." She gestured vaguely at the opulent room, at the 4-poster bed where she'd slept alone for 4 years, at the life she'd built from scraps of dignity and long stretches of silence. Her voice was quiet, almost conversational, as though she were discussing the weather, rather than dismantling their entire existence. Cassian felt something unfamiliar twist in his chest. Anger, probably, or perhaps just surprise that someone would dare defy him so casually. "You can't leave." Evelyn finally turned to face him. Her eyes, once bright with hope during their brief courtship, now held nothing but a terrible calm. Watch me. This is absurd. You're my wife. You have obligations, responsibilities. She smiled, and it was the saddest thing he'd ever seen. I fulfilled those obligations for 4 years, Cassian. I stood beside you at every banquet while you danced with her. I smiled through every humiliation while high society whispered about the Duke of Blackthorne and his beautiful mistress. I ate dinner alone in this palace of yours and pretended I didn't hear you laughing in the East Wing with a woman who isn't your wife. But obligations have limits, even for a duchess. He stepped further into the room, his presence filling the space the way it always did, commanding and absolute. This is about Margot. It was the first time he'd spoken his mistress's name in front of Evelyn. She didn't flinch. This is about me finally understanding that I deserve more than being a convenient title attached to a man who views love as weakness and marriage as another business contract. I gave you everything. He gestured at the room, at the estate beyond the windows, at the empire he'd built. Wealth, status, protection. You live in luxury most women only dream about. Evelyn returned to her packing, folding a winter cloak with the same maddening calm. You gave me everything except the one thing that mattered. You gave me a name without affection, a home without warmth, a marriage without respect. And when that wasn't enough cruelty, you brought another woman into our lives and expected me to smile through it because you're too powerful for anyone to question your choices. The truth of her words cut deeper than any blade. Cassian had spent his entire life believing that power meant taking whatever he wanted while the world remained too afraid to stop him. Money, land, political influence, women. He'd never considered that some things couldn't be claimed through dominance alone. Where will you go? My father's estate. He's expecting me. Lord Harrow knew about this. The realization stung. Even Evelyn's own father, a minor nobleman who'd been thrilled to marry his daughter into the powerful Ashford line, had chosen her side over maintaining favor with the Duke. He's known for weeks. I wrote to him the night I watched you kiss Margot in the library. The night you thought I was already asleep, but I came downstairs because I'd forgotten my book and found you with her in the one room that used to feel like mine. Cassian remembered that night. He remembered Margot's perfume, her laughter, the way she'd made him feel powerful in a way that didn't require crushing competitors or signing treaties. What he hadn't remembered was checking whether his wife might witness his betrayal. It simply hadn't occurred to him that her feelings mattered enough to consider. You're being dramatic. I'll send her away if that's what this tantrum requires. Evelyn closed the suitcase with a decisive click. This isn't a tantrum, Cassian. This is me choosing myself for the first time in 4 years. Send Margot away if you want. Bring her back tomorrow. It doesn't matter anymore because I won't be here to watch you destroy what little dignity I have left. She lifted the suitcase off the bed with both hands. Cassian moved to block the doorway, his considerable frame filling the exit. You're not leaving. Move. Her voice remained quiet, but something had changed in it, something sharp and final. I'm your husband. This is your home. You will stay. Evelyn set the suitcase down and looked up at him. 4 years ago, I married a man I thought I could learn to love. A man who seemed cold, but who I believe might soften with time and patience. Instead, I got a tyrant who views everyone around him as property to be managed. You want to know the worst part, Cassian? It's not that you took a mistress. It's that you genuinely don't understand why that would hurt me. You're so convinced that your power justifies anything you do that you've forgotten how to be human. I'm human enough to know when someone is making a mistake. Then stop me. She picked up the suitcase again. Force me to stay. Lock me in this gilded prison you built and prove that you're exactly the monster everyone whispers about when they think you can't hear. Or step aside and let me go with whatever scraps of pride I still possess. They stood there in the doorway, locked in a battle of wills that had been building for 4 years. Cassian could feel his heart pounding, could feel something close to panic creeping through his veins. But pride was a powerful thing, and he'd built his entire identity on never backing down. Never showing weakness, never admitting he might be wrong. He stepped aside. Evelyn walked past him without another word, her footsteps echoing down the marble hallway. He followed at a distance, watching as she descended the grand staircase where they'd posed for their wedding portrait. The same servants who'd witnessed their marriage now witnessed its ending. their faces carefully blank as the Duchess of Blackthorne walked toward the front doors with her single suitcase and her shattered heart. A carriage waited outside, her father's crest painted on the door. Lord Harrow himself stood beside it, older and grayer than Cassian remembered, his expression hard. "Your Grace." The title sounded like an insult. "My daughter will be staying with me until she decides her future." "This is her future." Cassian gestured at the manor behind him. "This is her home. This was her prison." Lord Harrow helped Evelyn into the carriage with gentle hands. "You turned my daughter into a ghost, Ashford. You took a woman full of life and hope and crushed her until she forgot how to smile without it being a performance. I gave you her hand in marriage because I thought you'd protect her. Instead, you destroyed her while high society watched and did nothing. She's my wife. She was your wife. What she is now depends entirely on whether you can learn to value people as something other than possessions." The carriage door closed. Evelyn sat inside, staring straight ahead, her face composed and distant. She didn't look at Cassian, didn't offer a final glance or a moment of hesitation. She simply sat there like a woman who'd already made peace with her decision, leaving him standing in the snow like a statue carved from regret. The carriage pulled away, wheels crunching through fresh powder. Cassian watched until it disappeared beyond the iron gates, until even the sound of hoofbeats faded into winter silence. He turned and walked back into Blackthorne Manor, the servants scattered like birds, none of them willing to meet his eyes. He climbed the stairs to his study, poured another whiskey, and stood at the window overlooking the empty gardens. The house felt different now, colder, more hollow, as though Evelyn's departure had taken something vital with her, some essential warmth he hadn't noticed until it was gone. His steward appeared in the doorway. "Your Grace, shall I have the Duchess's chambers prepared for her return?" Cassian didn't turn from the window. "She's not returning." "Surely this is just a temporary—" "She's not returning, Marcus. Make whatever arrangements need to be made." The steward withdrew, leaving Cassian alone with his empire and his emptiness. He thought about Margot, about how easy she'd been to acquire, how simple their arrangement was. No expectations beyond pleasure and expensive gifts, no demands for affection or respect. Just clean transactional companionship that required nothing from him except money. He sent word that evening, requesting Margot come to the manor. She arrived within the hour, beautiful and eager, wearing the emerald necklace he'd given her the previous week. They had dinner in the formal dining room where Evelyn used to sit across from him in silence. Margot filled that silence with laughter and flirtation, with stories about the latest society gossip and questions about his day that felt rehearsed rather than genuine. Halfway through the meal, Cassian realized he was comparing her to the wife who'd just left him. Margot's laugh was too loud. Her perfume was too strong. Her conversation was too eager to please, lacking any of the quiet dignity Evelyn had maintained even while he destroyed her. He excused himself early, claiming work. Margot pouted prettily, but accepted a diamond bracelet as compensation for the abbreviated evening. After she left, Cassian returned to his study and did something he hadn't done in years. He thought about his wife, not the distant figure who'd haunted the edges of his life for 4 years, but the woman he'd courted briefly before their marriage. Evelyn Harrow had been different then, younger and more open, with a smile that seemed genuine rather than performed. He'd chosen her because she was beautiful and well-bred, because marrying her had consolidated his alliance with several minor noble families, because she'd seemed biddable enough not to cause problems. He'd never bothered to learn what she liked, what made her laugh, what dreams she'd abandoned when she became his duchess. She'd been a means to an end, another piece moved across the board in his endless game of accumulating power. And now she was gone. The days that followed were strange. Cassian maintained his usual routines, attending parliament sessions and meeting with business associates, crushing any opposition to his various schemes with the same ruthless efficiency he'd always employed. But the manor felt wrong, empty in a way it never had before. Servants whispered in corners. He caught fragments of their conversations. Poor Duchess. Finally escaped. About time she stood up to him. The pity in their voices infuriated him, but he couldn't punish them for speaking the truth. Word spread quickly through high society. Within a week, everyone knew the Duchess of Blackthorne had left her husband and returned to her father's estate. The scandal delighted Cassian's enemies and concerned his allies. Invitations to social events began arriving with pointed questions about whether he'd be attending alone. He went to a ball 2 weeks after Evelyn's departure, Margot on his arm, determined to show the world that the Duke of Blackthorne didn't need anyone's approval. They entered the ballroom to a wave of whispers that cut through the music like knives. The poor Duchess. Can you imagine the humiliation? He parades his mistress while his wife suffers. Shameless. Absolutely shameless. Margot noticed the hostile stares and tightened her grip on his arm. Cassian led her to the dance floor with his head high, refusing to acknowledge the judgment radiating from every corner of the room. They danced, and he tried to ignore the way people stepped aside, as though his presence contaminated the very air. Lord Brennan, one of his political rivals, approached during a break in the music. Ashford, I heard about your domestic troubles. Such a shame when a good woman is driven away by her husband's cruelty. Cassian's jaw tightened. My personal affairs are none of your concern. Oh, but they are. Brennan smiled, sharp and knowing. You've built your empire on the appearance of absolute control, but a man who can't even keep his own wife seems rather less formidable than his reputation suggests. Makes one wonder what other weaknesses might be hiding behind all that arrogance. The barb hit its target. Cassian felt his carefully maintained composure crack just slightly. Careful, Brennan. You're testing limits you don't want to cross. Am I? Because from where I stand, you look like a man who's already lost the only battle that actually mattered. Brennan walked away, leaving Cassian standing in the middle of the ballroom with Margot still clinging to his arm and the entire aristocracy watching to see how the mighty Duke of Blackthorne would handle being challenged in public. He left early, claiming illness. Margot complained during the carriage ride home, upset about the stares and whispers, worried about her own reputation now that being the Duke of Blackthorne's mistress had become social poison rather than social currency. Maybe we should be more discreet, she suggested, her voice losing some of its usual warmth. Until this scandal with your wife dies down. Cassian looked at her in the dim carriage light and saw clearly for the first time. Margot had never cared about him. She'd cared about his money, his status, the luxury he could provide. The moment that luxury came with a cost, she started calculating her exit. Get out. She blinked. What? When we reach the manor, take whatever I've given you and leave. I'm done with you. Cassian, don't be ridiculous. I'm just suggesting. I said get out. They rode the rest of the way in silence. When the carriage stopped, Margot gathered her things with trembling hands, her face pale. You'll regret this. You need me. He didn't bother responding. The carriage pulled away, leaving him standing in front of Blackthorne Manor for the second time in 2 weeks, watching someone leave while he stood frozen in the snow. Inside, the house felt even emptier. He poured another whiskey and realized he'd been drinking more in the past 2 weeks than he had in the past 2 years. The alcohol didn't help. It just made the silence louder. Marcus appeared in the doorway of the study. Your Grace, a letter arrived from Lord Harrow's estate. Cassian's heart jumped in a way he didn't expect. He took the letter with hands that almost shook and broke the seal. The message was brief, written in Evelyn's neat script. I'm filing for a formal separation. My lawyers will contact yours regarding the necessary arrangements. Please don't write back. There's nothing left to say. No anger, no accusations, just cold, clinical detachment from a woman who'd finally stopped hoping he might change. Cassian read the letter 3 times before setting it on his desk. Then he did something he hadn't done since he was a child. He put his head in his hands and tried to remember the last time he'd told Evelyn he loved her. The memory wouldn't come because he'd never said those words. Not once in 4 years of marriage. He'd said, I need you to attend this event. I require your presence at dinner. I expect you to behave appropriately. But never I love you. Never, I'm sorry. Never thank you for enduring this life I've forced upon you. The next morning, he woke to more disturbing news. Lord Brennan had begun circulating rumors about potential financial irregularities in Cassian's shipping empire. The accusations were baseless, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that his enemies sensed weakness and were moving to exploit it. 2 of his most reliable political allies sent letters withdrawing their support for his upcoming trade legislation. Both letters mentioned his treatment of Evelyn as evidence of poor judgment. One actually used the phrase moral bankruptcy, which would have been laughable if it weren't costing him actual political capital. Marcus brought the morning papers, his expression grave. Your Grace, you should see this. The society column featured a detailed account of the ball, complete with speculation about why the Duchess of Blackthorne had finally abandoned her husband. The writer, clearly sympathetic to Evelyn, painted Cassian as a callous tyrant who destroyed a good woman through casual cruelty and shameless infidelity. At the bottom of the article was a smaller piece that made Cassian's blood run cold. Sources close to the Harrow family report that several noble suitors have already expressed interest in courting the recently separated Duchess, should her marriage be formally dissolved. Lord Edmund Thorne was seen calling at the Harrow estate twice this week, bringing flowers and books said to be the Duchess's favorites. Edmund Thorne, young, handsome, wealthy enough to be independent, and known throughout society as a genuinely decent man who treated women with respect. Everything Cassian wasn't. The image of another man courting Evelyn, bringing her flowers, making her smile the way she used to smile before Cassian crushed that joy out of her, hit him with unexpected force. He crumpled the newspaper and threw it into the fire, watching it burn while something dark and possessive twisted in his chest. "She's my wife." He said it out loud to the empty study, as though declaring it would make it true again, as though he could will the world back into the shape it had been before Evelyn decided she deserved better than being loved by a man incapable of love. Over the following weeks, Cassian's carefully constructed empire began showing cracks. Business partners started questioning his judgment. Political allies distanced themselves. Invitations to important social events stopped arriving. His reputation, built on absolute control and ruthless efficiency, couldn't survive the revelation that he'd driven away his own wife through such spectacular cruelty that even jaded aristocrats found it shocking. And everywhere he went, he heard whispers about Evelyn, about how well she looked now that she'd escaped Blackthorne Manor, about the color returning to her cheeks, about her laughter at social gatherings, bright and genuine for the first time in years, about Lord Edmund Thorne courting her with patient devotion, treating her the way Cassian never had. He tried to focus on work, on rebuilding his political alliances, on crushing Lord Brennan's attempts to undermine his business interests. But his concentration was shattered. He'd find himself staring out windows, thinking about the way Evelyn used to read in the library before he'd ruined that space by using it to seduce Margot. The way she'd played piano sometimes when she thought no one could hear, filling the empty manor with music that died the moment she realized he was listening. 3 months after she left, Cassian received another letter. This one bore the seal of Edmund Thorne. "Your Grace, I write to inform you that I have asked the Duchess of Blackthorne for permission to court her formally. Out of respect for her current situation, I wanted you to be aware of my intentions. Should her marriage be dissolved, I intend to offer her everything she deserves: devotion, respect, and a love untainted by cruelty or betrayal. Perhaps this will serve as a reminder that some treasures, once discarded, find their way into the hands of men wise enough to value them." Cassian read the letter until the words blurred. Then he stood, grabbed his coat, and did something he hadn't done in months. He went to find his wife. The ride to Lord Harrow's estate took 3 hours through increasingly heavy snow. Cassian's driver suggested turning back twice, but he refused. By the time they arrived, night had fallen and the storm had grown vicious, coating everything in ice. A servant answered the door, eyes widening in recognition. "Your Grace, we weren't expecting—" "Where is she?" Lord Harrow appeared in the entrance hall, his expression cold. "She's not here. There's a winter ball at the Thornton estate tonight. Most of high society is in attendance." Of course. Cassian should have known. The aristocracy never let something as trivial as a blizzard interfere with their parties. "Is Edmund Thorne there?" "I imagine so. He's been a frequent companion to my daughter recently. The kind of man who actually treats women with the respect they deserve." Cassian turned without another word and climbed back into the carriage. "Drive to the Thornton estate. Now. Your Grace, in this storm. Now." They rode through the blizzard, the horses struggling through deepening snow. Cassian sat in the freezing carriage and thought about what he'd say when he saw Evelyn. Apologies seemed inadequate. Explanations felt like excuses. But the image of Edmund Thorne dancing with her, making her laugh, being the man Cassian had been too proud and stupid to become, drove him forward through the storm. The Thornton estate blazed with light, visible through the swirling snow like a beacon. Music drifted from the ballroom, laughter and warmth spilling into the frozen night. Cassian climbed out of the carriage, looking half wild, his coat covered in snow, his hair disheveled, his eyes burning with something that might have been desperation if he'd been willing to name it. He burst through the ballroom doors like a man possessed, and the music stuttered to a halt as hundreds of faces turned toward him. There, in the center of the dance floor, Edmund Thorne stood with his hand on Evelyn's waist, frozen mid-waltz. Evelyn wore a gown the color of deep wine, her hair swept up in an elegant style that made her look both regal and heartbreakingly beautiful. She stared at Cassian with wide eyes, and for just a moment he saw something flicker across her face. Surprise. Maybe even concern for the snow-covered madman who'd just interrupted the most important social event of the season. Then her expression hardened into the same terrible calm she'd shown while packing her suitcase 3 months ago, and Cassian realized he was looking at a woman who'd already mourned their marriage and moved on to the business of rebuilding her life from the ashes he'd created. He crossed the ballroom floor in long strides, ignoring the gasps and whispers, his focus locked entirely on his wife and the man who thought he could steal her. When he reached them, Edmund Thorne stepped protectively in front of Evelyn, his jaw set. "Your Grace, you're causing a scene." Cassian barely glanced at him. He was looking at Evelyn, searching her face for any sign that she still cared, that 3 months hadn't erased 4 years of marriage completely, that somewhere beneath her dignity and her justified anger there might be something he could salvage. "I need to speak with you." Evelyn's voice was quiet, but carried across the silent ballroom. "We have nothing to discuss. We have everything to discuss. You're my wife. I was your wife. Now I'm just a woman trying to remember what it feels like to be treated like a human being instead of decorative furniture." The words landed like physical blows, and Cassian felt the ballroom watching, felt hundreds of aristocrats witnessing his humiliation the same way they'd witnessed Evelyn's for 4 years. The symmetry was almost poetic. "Please." The word tasted foreign on his tongue, a plea he'd never learned to make. "I was wrong. I know that now. I know I destroyed what we had through my own arrogance and cruelty, but I'm asking you to give me a chance to make this right." Edmund stepped forward, anger flashing in his eyes. "She's given you enough chances, Ashford. 4 years of chances while you paraded your mistress through society and treated her like she didn't exist. You don't get to ride through a blizzard and demand her forgiveness just because you're finally feeling the consequences of your actions." Cassian's hand shot out, grabbing Edmund's collar. "I wasn't talking to you." Evelyn's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Let him go, Cassian." He released Edmund immediately, his eyes never leaving Evelyn's face. She studied him for a long moment, and he wondered what she saw. The Duke who'd betrayed her? The husband who'd crushed her spirit? Or maybe, just maybe, the broken man standing in front of hundreds of witnesses, finally admitting he'd been wrong. "If you want to talk, we'll talk. But not here. Not like this." She walked past him toward the terrace doors, her spine straight, her head high. Cassian followed, aware of every eye tracking their movement, every whisper following in their wake. The terrace was freezing, snow piling against the stone railings. Evelyn stood at the edge, staring out at the storm, her arms wrapped around herself. Cassian shrugged off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. She didn't acknowledge the gesture. "Why are you here, Cassian?" "Because I can't let you go." She laughed, and it was the saddest sound he'd ever heard. "You let me go 3 months ago. You let me go every day for 4 years before that. What's changed?" "Everything. Nothing. I don't know." He moved to stand beside her, careful not to touch. "I just know that watching another man hold you, seeing you smile at him the way you used to smile before I destroyed that joy, it made me realize that power means nothing if I lose you. You already lost me. You lost me the first time you kissed Margot. You lost me every time you chose your pride over my dignity. You lost me when you made me feel invisible in my own home. Then let me find you again. Let me prove I can be different." Evelyn finally turned to look at him, and her eyes were filled with tears that refused to fall. "Do you love me, Cassian? After 4 years of marriage, after all the humiliation and betrayal and endless silence, can you honestly say you love me?" The question hung between them like a blade. Cassian opened his mouth to say yes, to tell her whatever she needed to hear, but the words stuck in his throat because he'd spent his entire life believing love was weakness, and he didn't know how to admit he'd been wrong. The silence stretched too long. Evelyn's expression shifted from hope to resignation, and Cassian watched the last ember of possibility die in her eyes. "That's what I thought." She pulled his coat off her shoulders and handed it back. Go home, Cassian. Go back to your empire and your power and your absolute control. I'm done being the ghost in your palace. She walked back into the ballroom, leaving him standing in the snow. Through the glass doors, he watched Edmund Thorne approach her, watched her accept his offered hand, watched them return to the dance floor while the orchestra resumed playing. And for the first time in his arrogant, ruthless life, Duke Cassian Ashford understood what it meant to lose something irreplaceable not through accident or fate, but through his own deliberate cruelty. And the knowledge that he had no one to blame but himself was more devastating than any business loss or political defeat could ever be. He rode home through the blizzard with his heart frozen solid and the terrible certainty that some mistakes are too big to fix, some betrayals too deep to forgive, and some women, once you've broken them completely, simply walk away and never look back. No matter how desperately you chase them through the snow. The ride back to Blackthorne Manor stretched through darkness thick enough to swallow hope whole. Cassian sat in the carriage with snow melting into his hair and the taste of defeat sharp on his tongue. His driver had stopped trying to make conversation after the first mile. Some silences were too heavy for words to penetrate. The manor loomed ahead like a mausoleum built for a man still breathing. Every window blazed with light, but somehow the building looked darker than the storm surrounding it. Cassian climbed out of the carriage and stood in the courtyard, staring up at the east wing where Evelyn's chambers sat empty. 3 months, and he still hadn't ordered anyone to touch her things. The room waited like a shrine to his failure, preserved exactly as she'd left it. Marcus met him at his door, his weathered face carefully neutral. Your Grace, Lord Brennan sent another letter. He's calling for a vote of no confidence regarding your shipping contracts. Cassian brushed past him without responding. The politics that had consumed his entire existence for decades suddenly felt distant and meaningless. He climbed the stairs to his study, poured whiskey he didn't want, and stood at the window watching snow bury the gardens where Evelyn used to walk before she learned that even the outdoors offered no escape from her prison. The decanter was half empty when Marcus appeared again, holding a silver tray with the Evening Post. Your Grace, there are documents requiring your signature, the contracts for the northern trade routes, the lease agreements for the London properties, Burn them. Marcus blinked. I'm sorry? All of it. Burn every contract, every letter, every piece of paper that says I'm supposed to care about empire building when the only thing that actually mattered just walked away because I was too goddamn proud to admit I loved her. The words hung in the air like confession. Marcus set the tray down slowly, his expression shifting from professional detachment to something almost paternal. Your Grace, if I may speak freely, when have I ever stopped you? You've spent 30 years building power because you believed it would protect you from being hurt the way your father was hurt when your mother died. You watched him fall apart, and you decided the solution was to never let anyone matter enough to destroy you. But you married the Duchess anyway, and somewhere in those 4 years of pushing her away, she became exactly what you were afraid of, someone who could break you just by leaving. Cassian turned from the window, his jaw tight. I don't recall asking for a psychological evaluation. No, you asked for honesty. Here it is. You treated that woman like furniture because you were terrified she'd become essential. And now she is, and she's gone. And you're standing here drinking yourself into oblivion because you finally figured out that control is just another word for cowardice when you're too afraid to love someone properly. Get out. Marcus didn't move. I've served your family since before you were born. I watched your father drink himself to death after your mother passed. I won't watch you do the same thing over a woman you drove away through your own stupidity. If you want her back, stop hiding in this study and go fight for her. And if you don't have the courage to do that, then at least have the decency to let her be happy with someone who does. He left before Cassian could respond, closing the door with a quiet click that sounded like judgment. Cassian stood alone in the study, surrounded by portraits of dead Ashfords who'd all believed that power meant crushing anyone who challenged you. 3 generations of dukes who'd died wealthy and miserable, their empires intact and their hearts empty. He threw the whiskey glass against the wall and watched it shatter. The next morning arrived with brutal clarity. Cassian woke on the leather couch in his study, his neck stiff and his mouth tasting like failure. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the broken glass he hadn't bothered to clean up. He sat up slowly, his head pounding, and realized something fundamental had shifted during the night. He was done running from this. Marcus brought coffee and fresh correspondence, his expression carefully blank after their confrontation. Your Grace, Lord Harrow has requested a meeting to discuss the formal separation terms. When? This afternoon, if you're available. Tell him I'll be there at 2. He spent the morning preparing like a general before battle. He bathed and dressed in his finest clothing, not because he thought appearances would save him, but because facing Evelyn's father required every scrap of dignity he could muster. The man had trusted Cassian with his daughter, and watched that trust be rewarded with humiliation and heartbreak. The ride to Lord Harrow's estate felt shorter in daylight. Cassian arrived exactly at 2, was shown into a receiving room decorated with fading elegance, and waited. Lord Harrow entered 10 minutes later, his expression hard enough to cut glass. Your Grace, the title sounded like an accusation. I assume you received my letter regarding the separation proceedings. Cassian remained standing, refusing to sit while Harrow loomed over him like judge and executioner. I received it. I'm not signing. That brought the older man up short. I beg your pardon? I'm not signing any separation documents. I'm not releasing Evelyn from our marriage. I'm not giving Edmund Thorne or anyone else permission to court my wife. Lord Harrow's face turned red. You arrogant bastard! You think you can treat my daughter like property you own regardless of her wishes? No. I think I can prove to her that I'm capable of change if she gives me the chance. But I can't do that if she's already moved on to another man. She has every right to move on. You destroyed her, Ashford. You took a bright, hopeful woman and crushed her until she forgot how to feel anything except humiliation. Do you have any idea what it's like watching your daughter lose herself piece by piece because her husband views love as weakness? Cassian met his gaze without flinching. I know exactly what I did. I know I deserve every ounce of her hatred and your contempt. But I also know that giving up now means accepting that I'm exactly the monster everyone says I am, and I'm not ready to do that. What you're ready for is irrelevant. This isn't about you anymore. Then let Evelyn tell me herself that she wants nothing to do with me. Let her look me in the eye and say she's done, and I'll sign whatever papers you put in front of me. But I won't surrender my marriage based on your anger or society's judgment. I'll surrender it when she tells me directly that I've lost her forever. Lord Harrow studied him for a long moment, searching for deception or manipulation in Cassian's face. Whatever he saw there made him shake his head slowly. You don't deserve another chance. Probably not, but I'm asking for one anyway. She's not here. She went riding this morning. Won't be back until evening. Then I'll wait. Harrow gestured toward the door with barely contained fury. Wait outside. I won't have you in my house longer than necessary. Cassian returned to his carriage and told his driver to stay. The afternoon stretched long and cold. He watched servants come and go, watched the sun track across the winter sky, watched his breath fog in the freezing air. His driver offered a blanket. Cassian refused it. Discomfort felt appropriate, like penance measured in frozen limbs and growing darkness. Evelyn returned just as twilight was bleeding into night. She rode up the path on a gray mare, her cheeks flushed from cold and exercise, her expression open in a way it never was inside drawing rooms. Then she saw the Ashford carriage, and her entire demeanor changed. The openness vanished behind walls built from 4 years of learning that vulnerability near Cassian Ashford meant pain. She dismounted and handed the reins to a stable boy without acknowledging Cassian's presence. He climbed out of the carriage anyway, his legs stiff from hours of waiting. Evelyn. She paused, her back to him. Go home, Cassian. Not until you hear me out. I heard you out last night. You said everything except the one thing that mattered. She was right. He'd stood in the snow and couldn't force himself to say he loved her because 30 years of emotional armor didn't crack that easily. But he'd had all day to think about it, all those frozen hours in the carriage, and he'd finally admitted something to himself that he should have admitted 4 years ago. I love you. The words came out rough and unpracticed, like a language he'd never learned to speak properly. Evelyn turned slowly, her expression unreadable. You love me. Yes. Since when? I don't know. Maybe since the day you walked down the aisle looking terrified and hopeful. Maybe since the first time you smiled at me and I felt something I didn't want to name. Maybe since the moment I found you packing your suitcase and realized power means nothing if I lose you. I don't know when it started, Evelyn. I just know it's there, and it's real. And I've been too goddamn proud and stupid to admit it until I watched another man hold you the way I should have been holding you for 4 years. She studied him like she was searching for lies in the gaps between words. Do you know what the worst part was? It wasn't watching you with Margot. It wasn't the humiliation or the loneliness or the endless silence. The worst part was knowing that you were capable of warmth and affection and all the things that make a marriage real, but you chose to give those things to someone else. While I sat in that empty manor and wondered what was wrong with me, that my own husband couldn't stand to touch me. There's nothing wrong with you. There never was. The problem was me believing that showing affection meant showing weakness, and if I was weak, I could be destroyed the way my father was destroyed when my mother died. So I built walls and called it strength, and I married you thinking I could keep you at a distance forever. But you got under my skin anyway, and instead of accepting that, I punished you for making me feel things I'd spent my whole life avoiding. Evelyn wrapped her arms around herself, her breath fogging in the cold. Pretty words, Cassian, but words are cheap. You've had 4 years to figure this out. Why now? Because I left? Because Edmund Thorne is courting me? Because your reputation is suffering? Because I'm tired of being the villain in my own life? Because I wake up in that manor and it feels like a tomb? Because I attended a ball 2 weeks ago and some lord I've never met approached me and said he was glad my wife finally escaped before I killed her spirit completely. And I realized he was right. I did kill your spirit. I took someone bright and full of hope and crushed her systematically until she forgot how to smile without it being a performance. And I'm standing here now because I want a chance to undo that damage, even though I know I probably don't deserve it. The door to the manor opened. Lord Harrow stood silhouetted in the light, watching them. Evelyn glanced back at her father, then returned her attention to Cassian. If I give you this chance, it won't be easy. I won't move back into Blackthorne Manor and pretend the last 4 years didn't happen. I won't smile through your political dinners or play the dutiful Duchess while you rebuild your empire. If you want me back, you'll have to earn me the way you should have earned me from the beginning. Tell me how. Court me. Properly. The way Edmund Thorne is courting me. Bring me flowers, write me letters. Take me to dinner and actually talk to me like I'm a person instead of decorative furniture. Prove that you can see me as something other than a possession you own. And if I do all that, if I prove I can change, then maybe, eventually, I'll consider returning. But I make no promises, Cassian. You broke something fundamental when you paraded Margot through society while I sat home alone. Trust doesn't rebuild overnight. I understand. Do you? Because this isn't a business negotiation where you can manipulate the terms in your favor. This is me setting boundaries for the first time in 4 years, and if you cross them, I'm gone permanently. No more chances, no more dramatic speeches and snowstorms, just a clean break and a life built with someone who actually knows how to love me properly. The implicit threat of Edmund Thorne hung between them like a blade. Cassian felt jealousy twist his stomach but forced it down. She was right to have options, right to demand better treatment, right to make him work for something he should never have taken for granted. I'll court you properly. I'll prove I can be different, and I won't ask you to trust me until I've earned it. Evelyn nodded slowly. Then you can start by leaving. I need to think about what I've just agreed to, and I can't do that with you standing here looking desperate. He wanted to argue, to push harder, to use all his considerable force of will to break through her defenses immediately. But that was the old Cassian, the Duke who took whatever he wanted without considering the cost. The new version, the one trying to become worthy of her, simply bowed his head. When can I see you again? 3 days. There's a gallery opening in town. Edmund invited me, but I'll tell him I'm attending with you instead. Consider it your first test. Can you spend an entire evening treating me like someone you actually want to know, rather than someone you're obligated to escort? I can do better than that. I can spend the evening proving that the biggest mistake of my life was thinking I could live without you. She almost smiled. Then it vanished behind her careful composure. We'll see. He returned to his carriage while Evelyn disappeared inside her father's house. The driver glanced back questioningly. Home, Your Grace? Cassian thought about Blackthorne Manor, about the empty corridors and the silence that had become unbearable. No. Take me to the florist in town. Then the bookshop, then the jeweler. It's nearly 8 at night. Most shops will be closed. Then wake them up. Tell them the Duke of Blackthorne needs flowers, books, and something appropriate for a woman he's trying to win back after being a complete bastard for 4 years. Tell them I'll pay double for the inconvenience. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Cassian researched everything he could remember about Evelyn's interests. She liked poetry, he recalled, though he'd never bothered to ask which poets. She played piano, though he'd always left the room when she started because the music made him feel things he didn't want to examine. She read constantly, curled up in the library with books he'd never taken time to notice. He visited every bookshop in town until he found a first edition of a poetry collection she'd mentioned once in passing during their engagement. He bought flowers, but not roses, because those felt too obvious, too much like buying forgiveness rather than earning it. He chose winter jasmine instead, delicate and rare, blooming and cold when everything else had died. Marcus watched these preparations with barely concealed approval. Your Grace, if I may say so, this is the most alive you've looked in months. I'm courting my own wife like a nervous boy at his first dance. It's humiliating. It's human. You should try it more often. The night of the gallery opening arrived with fresh snow and bitter cold. Cassian dressed carefully, choosing understated elegance over the aggressive displays of wealth he usually favored. He arrived at Lord Harrow's estate exactly on time, flowers and book in hand, his heart pounding in a way it never did before Parliament sessions or business negotiations. Evelyn descended the stairs wearing a gown of deep blue that made her look like winter royalty. She'd done something different with her hair, softer and less formal than the severe styles she'd adopted during their marriage. She looked younger, more like the woman he'd courted briefly before crushing her beneath his need for control. You brought flowers. Winter jasmine. They bloom in snow when everything else has given up. Seemed appropriate. She took them carefully, her fingers brushing his. And the book? First edition. Poetry collection you mentioned during our engagement. I didn't remember which one, so I asked your father. He seemed pleased I was actually paying attention for once. Something flickered in her expression. Not quite trust, but maybe the beginning of softening. Thank you. They're lovely. The carriage ride to the gallery stretched tense and silent. Cassian wanted to fill the quiet with explanations and apologies, but Evelyn had been clear. He needed to court her properly, which meant conversation instead of declarations, questions instead of demands. What kind of art do you prefer? He asked it like he was genuinely curious, which was terrifying because he had no idea how she'd respond. Evelyn glanced at him, surprise evident in her eyes. You've never asked me that before. I've never asked you a lot of things. I'm trying to fix that. She studied him for a moment, then answered. Landscapes, mostly. Not the formal hunting scenes your ancestors preferred. More intimate pieces. Gardens in twilight, windows with rain, quiet moments captured before they disappear. Why? Because they remind me that beauty exists in ordinary things if you bother to look. Something I forgot while living in a palace filled with grandeur and absolutely no warmth. The observation cut deep, but he deserved it. What else did you forget? How to laugh without calculating whether it was appropriate. How to trust my own judgment instead of second-guessing everything based on your reactions. How to exist as something other than an ornament in someone else's empire. I want you to remember all those things. I want you to laugh again. Really laugh, not the polite sounds you made at dinner parties. I want you to trust yourself enough to tell me when I'm being an arrogant bastard. I want you to exist as your own person instead of an extension of my reputation. Evelyn turned to look out the window, but not before he saw tears threaten at the corners of her eyes. You're saying all the right things, Cassian, but I need you to understand that words are easy. Sustaining change is hard. Then watch me sustain it. Watch me prove that I can be different not just for a night or a week, but permanently. The gallery was crowded with aristocrats who all turned to stare when Cassian entered with Evelyn on his arm. The whispers started immediately, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. The Duke and Duchess. Together. After months of separation. What does it mean? Has he won her back? Does Edmund Thorne know? Cassian ignored them all. He focused entirely on Evelyn, guiding her through the exhibits, asking her opinion on each piece, actually listening when she explained why certain paintings moved her. He didn't perform for the watching crowd, didn't use her presence to rebuild his reputation, just existed beside her as though nothing else in the room mattered. They stopped in front of a landscape painting showing a garden in early morning light. Evelyn stared at it for a long time, her expression unreadable. What are you thinking? That I used to walk in the gardens at Blackthorne before dawn because it was the only time I felt like the estate belonged to me instead of to your legacy. The rest of the day I was just a duchess performing her duties, but those early mornings were mine. Why didn't you tell me? Because you never asked. And because I learned early in our marriage that you weren't interested in my internal life. You wanted a decorative wife who enhanced your status, not a real person with thoughts and feelings. Cassian felt the familiar urge to defend himself, to explain that he'd been protecting himself from vulnerability. But Evelyn had heard enough excuses. She needed action instead of words. Come with me. Where? Somewhere I should have taken you years ago. He led her out of the gallery into the snowy night, ignoring the confused stares. His carriage waited outside, but he bypassed it, walking instead through the quiet streets until they reached a small park overlooking the city. Snow covered the benches and trees, muffling sound until the world felt intimate and private. Why are we here? Because I want to show you something real instead of performing for an audience. He turned to face her, his breath fogging in the cold. Every moment we had together in our marriage was calculated. Dinners scheduled by Marcus, appearances planned for maximum political advantage. Even our wedding night felt like fulfilling a contract rather than beginning a life together. I want this to be different. No servants, no society watching, just us in a park in the snow. And me trying to figure out how to be honest with someone for the first time in my life. Evelyn wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. Then be honest. Tell me something you've never told anyone. Cassian had spent 3 decades avoiding precisely this kind of vulnerability. But standing in the snow with the only person who'd ever mattered looking at him like he might still be capable of redemption, he found words he'd buried for years. When my mother died, my father stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped caring about anything except the fact that she was gone. I was 12 years old and I watched him waste away over 6 months until he was just a shell sitting in her favorite chair, waiting to die. The servants whispered that love killed him, that if he'd never cared so deeply, he could have survived losing her. So I decided I'd never let anyone matter that much. I'd build an empire strong enough that I'd never need another person. And I'd marry someone I could keep at a distance so I'd never end up like him, broken and helpless and destroyed by grief. And did it work? For a while. I built everything I set out to build, became powerful enough that no one could hurt me. Married a woman I thought I could keep compartmentalized. But then you left, and I realized I'd become exactly what I was trying to avoid. I'm sitting in my father's study drinking myself into oblivion because you're gone. And all that power means nothing without you there to make the manor feel like something other than a mausoleum. Tears slid down Evelyn's cheeks, freezing against her skin. You can't put that on me, Cassian. You can't make me responsible for your happiness after 4 years of making me feel responsible for your misery. I'm not. I'm trying to explain why I was so goddamn broken that I broke you in return. I'm trying to show you that underneath all the arrogance and cruelty, there's a scared 12-year-old who watched love destroy his father and decided destroying love first was safer. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. What changed? You did. The way you folded your clothes and walked away without screaming or begging or giving me any ammunition to call you hysterical or emotional. You just left with quiet dignity. And it made me realize that real strength isn't crushing everyone around you. It's having the courage to be vulnerable with someone and trusting they won't use it against you. Edmund Thorne appeared at the park entrance like a ghost summoned by jealousy. His expression shifted from concern to angry when he saw Cassian standing close to Evelyn in the darkness. Evelyn, is everything all right? When you didn't return to the gallery, I grew worried. She turned toward him, her face still wet with tears. I'm fine, Edmund. Cassian and I were just talking. Talking. Edmund's voice carried barely restrained fury. You're crying in a park in the middle of winter while the man who destroyed you stands there looking like he thinks a few pretty words will fix 4 years of cruelty. Cassian felt rage ignite in his chest. Watch your tone, Thorne. Or what? You'll challenge me to a duel? Destroy my family's business interests? Use your power to crush anyone who points out what a bastard you've been to your own wife? Edmund, please. Evelyn stepped between them, her voice steady despite the tears. I appreciate your concern, but this is between Cassian and me. No, it's not. Edmund's hands clenched into fists. It's between a good woman who deserves better and a tyrant who thinks he can reclaim her like lost property, just because his reputation is suffering. He turned to Evelyn, his expression softening. You don't owe him anything. You don't have to listen to his excuses or give him chances he never gave you. You can walk away right now and build a life with someone who actually knows how to love you. The words hung between them like a gauntlet thrown. Cassian understood what was happening. Edmund was offering Evelyn everything he should have offered years ago. Safety, respect, devotion untainted by cruelty. He was the better man by every objective measure, and they all knew it. But Evelyn didn't move toward Edmund. She stood in the snow between them, her eyes closed, her breath coming in short bursts. Edmund, you've been nothing but kind to me. You've treated me with more respect in 3 months than Cassian showed me in 4 years. If I had any sense at all, I'd choose you without hesitation. Then choose me. Edmund reached for her hand. Let me show you what it's like to be loved by someone who isn't afraid of his own heart. She pulled away gently. But I can't build something new with you while I'm still trying to figure out if there's anything left worth salvaging with him. And I need you to respect that, even if you don't understand it. Edmund's face went pale. You're choosing him, after everything he did. I'm not choosing anyone yet. I'm asking for time to figure out what I want without being pressured by either of you. That's not fair, Evelyn. I've been patient. I've courted you properly. I've done everything right while he did everything wrong. And you're still considering going back to him. Love isn't fair. If it was, I'd hate Cassian and move on without a second thought. But feelings don't follow logic, and apparently mine are complicated enough that I need space to work through them. Edmund looked between them, his expression shifting from anger to something closer to heartbreak. Fine, take your time. But when you realize he hasn't actually changed, when he reverts to the controlling bastard who destroyed you the first time, don't expect me to be waiting. I deserve better than being someone's backup plan. He walked away into the snow, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Evelyn watched him go, tears streaming freely now. Cassian wanted to feel victorious, wanted to claim Edmund's retreat as proof he'd won. But watching Evelyn cry over the good man she might be losing to gamble on the bastard who'd already broken her made victory feel like ash. I'm sorry. She turned to him, anger flashing in her eyes. For what? For making me hurt someone who's only ever been kind to me? For putting me in a position where I have to choose between safety and the stupid, irrational hope that you might actually become the man you're pretending to be tonight? For all of it. For the past 4 years. For Margot. For every humiliation and every silent dinner and every moment you felt invisible in your own home. For being so goddamn broken that I broke you in return. For making you choose at all. You want to know something? She stepped closer, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Part of me hates you, Cassian. Part of me wants to walk away right now and never look back because giving you another chance feels like betraying myself. But there's another part, this stupid, hopeful part that still remembers the man who courted me briefly before our wedding. The one who actually smiled when I walked into a room. The one who made me believe I might matter to someone. And that part keeps wondering if he's still in there somewhere, buried under years of armor and fear. He is. I swear to you, Evelyn, that man is still here and he's fighting like hell to become worthy of you. Then prove it. Not just tonight with pretty words in the snow. Prove it over weeks and months. Prove you can sustain change when it's hard, when your pride demands you go back to being the Duke everyone fears. Prove that loving me matters more than protecting yourself from being hurt. I will. But I need something from you first. A promise that if I give you this chance and you fail, you'll let me go completely. No dramatic gestures, no riding through snowstorms to interrupt my life. Just a clean break and the dignity to build something new without you haunting the edges of it. The request felt like a noose tightening around his throat. Cassian had spent his entire life refusing to let anything go without a fight. But this wasn't about what he wanted. It was about respecting Evelyn enough to let her set terms for her own life. I promise. If I fail you again, I'll sign the separation papers and disappear from your life completely. She studied his face like she was memorizing it. Then court me properly, Duke Ashford. Show me you can be different. And maybe, eventually, I'll let myself believe you've actually changed. They returned to the gallery together, ignoring the stares and whispers. Cassian took her home to her father's estate and watched her disappear inside without a backward glance. Lord Harrow stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Did you mean it? The old man asked quietly. All those promises about change? I meant every word. Then you'd better follow through, because if you hurt her again, there won't be enough power in the world to protect you from what I'll do." Cassian drove back to Blackthorne Manor feeling lighter and more terrified than he'd felt in years. He'd made promises he wasn't sure he could keep, committed to changing patterns that had defined him for decades, put everything on the line for a woman who had every reason to choose the safe option of Edmund Thorne over the risky gamble of trusting him again. But as he climbed the stairs to his study and looked out at the snow-covered grounds, he realized something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in his life, he cared more about becoming worthy of love than about maintaining control. And whether that made him stronger or weaker, he couldn't say. He only knew that turning back now felt impossible, like trying to unring a bell or unbreak glass that had already shattered across marble floors. The weeks that followed felt like learning to breathe underwater. Cassian courted Evelyn with the careful attention of a man defusing a bomb, knowing one wrong move would detonate everything he was trying to rebuild. He sent letters every morning, not the brief formal communications he'd issued during their marriage, but actual correspondence where he asked about her day and told her things he'd never shared with anyone. He brought her books he thought she'd enjoy based on authors she'd mentioned in passing. He took her to concerts and actually listened to the music instead of calculating which politicians were in attendance. And slowly, painfully, he watched the walls around her heart begin to crack, just enough to let cautious hope seep through. But empires built on fear don't crumble quietly when their foundations shift. And Cassian's decision to prioritize Evelyn over power had not gone unnoticed by men who'd spent years waiting for weakness to exploit. It started with small things: a trade contract that vanished overnight despite verbal agreements, a shipping route suddenly awarded to a competitor, whispers in Parliament that the Duke of Blackthorne had gone soft, more concerned with winning back his wayward wife than protecting his business interests. Cassian noticed but didn't care enough to respond with his usual ruthlessness. He was too focused on the way Evelyn had almost smiled when he'd remembered she preferred tea to coffee, too consumed with proving he could sustain change, to worry about men who mistook love for weakness. Marcus tried to warn him. "Your Grace, Lord Brennan has been meeting privately with several of your key allies. He's building something. Let him build. I have more important things to worry about than Brennan's political games. With respect, you can't ignore this. He's calling in favors, consolidating support. If you don't respond soon, you'll lose ground you can't recover. Then I'll lose ground. I'm not sacrificing what I'm building with Evelyn to crush another ambitious lord who thinks he can take what's mine." Marcus's expression tightened with concern. "Your father used to say that power requires constant vigilance. The moment you stop defending your empire is the moment it starts collapsing. My father also drank himself to death because he couldn't survive losing someone he loved. I'd rather risk losing power than repeat that particular family legacy." But Marcus was right to worry. 3 weeks into Cassian's careful courtship of Evelyn, the attack came from a direction he'd never anticipated. He was meeting with his shipping managers when a courier arrived with an urgent message sealed with the royal crest. Cassian opened it, expecting some routine parliamentary business, and instead found words that stopped his heart. The document was a formal accusation of treason. According to the charges, Cassian had been secretly negotiating with foreign merchants to divert crown shipping contracts into his private enterprises, enriching himself at the expense of the kingdom's treasury. The evidence cited specific dates, specific meetings, specific amounts that matched his actual business dealings, but were framed to look like criminal conspiracy rather than legitimate commerce. He read the accusations twice, his mind racing through possibilities. Someone had taken his legitimate business operations and twisted them into something treasonous. Someone with access to his private records. Someone close enough to know the intimate details of deals conducted behind closed doors. Who would have this information? Marcus appeared pale and shaken. "Your Grace, only your inner circle has access to those records. Your lawyers, your accountants, and me." Cassian's jaw tightened. "Then one of my inner circle is selling me out to my enemies." He spent the next 2 days investigating, calling in favors, tracing the source of the accusations. The trail led exactly where he feared it would. His head accountant, a man he'd trusted for 15 years, had been feeding information to Lord Brennan in exchange for a position in Brennan's financial empire. But that betrayal, while damaging, wasn't the killing blow. The killing blow came when he discovered that the initial contact between his accountant and Brennan had been facilitated by someone Cassian would never have suspected in 1,000 years of paranoid suspicion. Edmund Thorne. The discovery hit like physical violence. Edmund, who'd courted Evelyn with such obvious devotion. Edmund, who'd positioned himself as the moral alternative to Cassian's cruelty. Edmund, who'd walked away from their confrontation in the park looking heartbroken and noble. That same Edmund had been quietly working with Cassian's enemies to destroy him politically while publicly playing the role of honorable suitor. Cassian stood in his study holding proof of Edmund's involvement and felt something break inside him that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with the realization that even his attempts at redemption were being weaponized against him. Marcus reviewed the evidence with mounting horror. He's been planning this for months, since before the Duchess even left you. He must have known about your troubles and positioned himself to take advantage when your marriage collapsed. The strategic brilliance was almost admirable. Edmund had courted Evelyn genuinely enough while simultaneously feeding Cassian's business rivals the ammunition they needed to destroy him. If the treason charges stuck, Cassian would lose everything. His title, his estates, possibly his freedom. And Evelyn, believing her husband was a criminal as well as a bastard, would run straight into Edmund's arms thinking she'd found safety with a good man who'd rescued her from a monster. What will you do? Cassian stared at the evidence spread across his desk and felt the old instincts roar to life. Crush him. Destroy Edmund Thorne so completely that his family name becomes synonymous with betrayal. Use every connection, every weapon, every ruthless tactic that made me Duke of Blackthorne in the first place. He could do it too. He had the resources, the contacts, the willingness to use methods that would horrify decent people. He could reduce Edmund to nothing and prove to the world that challenging him came with consequences so severe they'd serve as warnings for generations. But destroying Edmund meant becoming exactly the monster he'd been trying to stop being. It meant choosing power over redemption. It meant sacrificing his relationship with Evelyn on the altar of revenge because she'd never forgive him for crushing the man who'd shown her kindness, no matter how duplicitous that kindness turned out to be. He thought about the promise he'd made in the snow. If I fail you again, I'll sign the separation papers and disappear from your life completely. He'd meant it then. But that was before he understood the full scope of the trap closing around him. There was a third option. He could take the evidence to Evelyn, show her who Edmund really was. Let her see that the noble suitor was just another player in the endless game of aristocratic backstabbing. But that felt like manipulation too, like using truth as a weapon to damage her trust in someone else rather than earning her trust through his own actions. Marcus watched him wrestle with the decision. Your Grace, if you don't act soon, the treason charges will proceed to trial. You'll be arrested. Everything you've built will be destroyed. Then it gets destroyed. I'm not sacrificing who I'm trying to become just to save what I was. That's madness. You can't just surrender to this. Watch me. I spent 30 years crushing anyone who challenged me, and where did it get me? Sitting alone in this study drinking whiskey while the only person who mattered walked away because I'd forgotten how to be human. I'm not going back to that version of myself, Marcus. Not even to survive. So you'll just let Edmund Thorne destroy you? Cassian gathered the evidence and locked it in his desk drawer. I'm going to do something I should have done 4 years ago. I'm going to be honest with Evelyn about everything and let her make her own decisions without me manipulating the outcome. He sent a message requesting to see her that evening. She agreed, suggesting they meet at a neutral location rather than her father's estate or Blackthorne Manor. They chose a small tea room on the edge of town, quiet enough for private conversation, but public enough to prevent the kind of emotional devastation that came from isolated confrontations. Evelyn arrived first, settling into a corner table with her back to the wall. She wore gray, the color of winter storms, and her expression was carefully guarded. Cassian had been courting her for nearly a month now, and he'd started to recognize the subtle shifts in her demeanor. Right now she looked braced for bad news, as though some instinct had warned her this meeting wouldn't be flowers and poetry. He sat across from her and ordered tea he wouldn't drink. They observed the rituals of polite society, asking about each other's day, commenting on the weather, dancing around the real conversation until the tea arrived and the server retreated out of earshot. You look troubled. Evelyn's voice was soft but wary. What happened? Cassian had spent the entire ride rehearsing how to explain this without sounding like he was trying to poison her against Edmund. Every version felt manipulative, So he abandoned strategy and went with raw truth instead. I've been accused of treason. The Crown has evidence that makes it look like I've been diverting royal shipping contracts for personal profit. If the charges proceed to trial, I'll lose everything. My title, the estates, possibly my freedom. Her teacup froze halfway to her lips. That's absurd. You're many things, Cassian, but a traitor to the Crown isn't one of them. The charges are false, but the evidence is real enough to look convincing. Someone's been feeding my business records to my enemies and framing legitimate deals as criminal conspiracy. Who would do that? This was the moment. The choice between protecting her from ugly truth or respecting her enough to let her see the world as it actually was. I know who. I have proof. But before I tell you, I need you to understand something. I'm not sharing this information to manipulate you or to damage your relationships. I'm telling you because I promise to be honest. And that means being honest even when the truth makes me look weak or destroys something you value. Evelyn set her cup down with deliberate care. Just tell me. Edmund Thorne has been working with Lord Brennan to destroy me. He facilitated the contact between my accountant and my enemies. He's known about the treason accusations for weeks and never warned either of us. And based on the timeline, he started positioning himself to court you before you even left Blackthorne Manor, which means his entire noble suitor act was calculated from the beginning. The color drained from her face. You're lying. I wish I was. He slid a folder across the table. This is proof. Letters, financial records, testimony from my accountant admitting Edmund approached him first. I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm asking you to look at the evidence and draw your own conclusions. She opened the folder with trembling hands. Cassian watched her face as she read, watched hope and trust crack apart like ice over deep water. She went through every page twice, her breathing growing shallow, her knuckles white against the paper. When she finally looked up, her eyes were dry but devastated. Why didn't you destroy him? You have everything you need to crush him completely. That's what the old Cassian would have done. The old Cassian would have reduced him to nothing and enjoyed every moment of it. But I'm trying to be different. I'm trying to be the man you need me to be, which means not using cruelty as my default response, even when it's justified. So what are you going to do? Nothing. I'll defend myself against the treason charges, but I won't attack Edmund. I won't use this information as a weapon. I'll let you decide what it means and how you want to handle it. Evelyn's laugh was bitter and broken. How generous of you. Letting me make my own decisions about the man who pretended to care about me while using me as a pawn in his game against you. I'm sorry. For what? For being right about him? For having proof that everyone in this goddamn aristocracy is playing games with other people's lives? Or for making me feel stupid for believing someone might actually want me for reasons that had nothing to do with hurting you? For all of it. For the fact that my past actions created a situation where decent men could pretend to rescue you while actually just using you to get to me. For not protecting you better from people who see you as leverage instead of a person. She closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. I need time to process this. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. Yes, you are. The treason charges will move forward. You'll be arrested within days unless you can prove your innocence. And even if you do, your reputation will be destroyed. The Duke of Blackthorne, brought low by his own accountant and the noble lord everyone thought was so much better than him. I can survive a damaged reputation. I'm not sure I can survive losing you again. Evelyn stood, gathering her cloak with shaking hands. You're not losing me. You never had me to lose. What we've been doing these past weeks is performing reconciliation, not actually living it. I've been waiting for you to fail, Cassian, waiting for proof that people don't really change. And now I have it, except the failure isn't yours. It's mine. I was so desperate to believe in Edmund's goodness that I let myself be used as a weapon against you. That's not failure. That's hoping for better than what you'd experienced. There's no shame in that. Tell me something honestly. If you didn't have this evidence, if you couldn't prove Edmund was betraying both of us, would you still be sitting here choosing not to destroy him? Or would the old instincts have won? The question cut to the bone because Cassian wasn't entirely sure of the answer. He wanted to believe he'd choose mercy regardless. But the truth was murkier. The evidence had made it easier to be noble because he could prove Edmund's duplicity without becoming the villain. Without proof, would he have trusted his own transformation enough to stay his hand? I don't know. I'd like to think I would, but I've only been trying to change for a few weeks, and 30 years of training doesn't disappear that fast. So honestly, I don't know if I'm noble enough yet to choose mercy when I can't prove the other person deserves punishment. She studied his face like she was memorizing every line. That's the first truly honest thing you've said to me in 4 years of marriage. Not a calculated answer. Not what you think I want to hear. Just raw truth that makes you look uncertain and human instead of powerful and controlled. Is that good or bad? I have no idea. I just know I need to think about what it means. She'd left without another word, disappearing into the winter evening while Cassian sat alone at a table set for two, staring at the folder of evidence that had just destroyed whatever fragile trust he'd been building. The next morning brought the arrest he'd been expecting. Royal guards arrived at Blackthorne Manor with a warrant bearing the crown's seal. Cassian was taken into custody with all the ceremony befitting a duke accused of treason, which meant shackles disguised as courtesy and imprisonment dressed up as protective custody. They held him in a manor house rather than a dungeon because aristocrats didn't suffer common jail cells even when accused of capital crimes. But the guards at every door and the locked windows made it clear this was confinement regardless of the velvet upholstery. He spent 3 days reviewing his defense with lawyers who looked increasingly worried as they examined the fabricated evidence. The case against him was circumstantial but damning. Without proof of the conspiracy between Edmund and Brennan, it looked like Cassian had been systematically stealing from the crown while hiding behind legitimate business operations. Marcus was allowed to visit on the 4th day. He brought fresh clothing and news that made Cassian's carefully maintained composure crack. The Duchess confronted Edmund Thorne publicly at the Northgate Ball last night, accused him in front of half the aristocracy of using her to destroy you. He denied everything, called the evidence forged, suggested you'd manufactured the whole conspiracy to drive a wedge between them. Did she believe him? I don't know. She left the ball early. But there's more. Lord Brennan has announced his intention to testify against you at trial. He's claiming you approached him about the scheme, and he refused, and now he's coming forward out of civic duty. The audacity was almost impressive. Brennan had orchestrated the entire plot and was now positioning himself as a whistleblower exposing corruption. Classic political theater that would play beautifully to a jury already inclined to believe the worst about powerful nobles. How long until trial? 2 weeks. Your lawyers are filing motions, but the Crown wants this resolved quickly, probably worried that dragging it out will make them look weak. Then I have 2 weeks to prove my innocence while locked in this gilded cage. Your Grace, with respect, your innocence might not matter. The evidence is compelling enough that even if you're acquitted, the suspicion will destroy you. You need to consider alternatives, such as exile. Several allied nations would grant you sanctuary. You could disappear, rebuild somewhere the Crown's reach doesn't extend, start fresh without the weight of this scandal, and abandon everything? The estates. The legacy? Evelyn. If you stay and fight, you might lose all of that anyway. At least exile gives you control over the terms of your loss. Cassian stood at the window overlooking gardens he might never walk again and thought about the life he'd built through ruthless ambition and strategic cruelty. Was it worth saving? Did he even want to be Duke of Blackthorne anymore if it meant going back to the man he'd been before Evelyn folded her clothes and walked away? I'm not running. If I'm going down fighting. And if I lose everything, at least I'll lose it knowing I tried to be better than what I was. That's remarkably principled for a man accused of treason. Or remarkably stupid. I haven't decided which yet. Marcus left him alone with his thoughts and his dwindling options. Night fell. Cassian paced the confines of his temporary prison and contemplated the spectacular destruction of everything he'd spent his life building. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd treated power as the ultimate goal, believing it would protect him from vulnerability and loss. Instead, that same power had made him a target for ambitious men who understood that empires built on fear toppled spectacularly when their foundations cracked. A guard knocked on the door near midnight. Your Grace, you have a visitor. Says it's urgent. Who? The Duchess of Blackthorne. Cassian's heart jumped in a way that would have embarrassed him if anyone could see his face. Show her in. Evelyn entered wrapped in a dark cloak, her hair loose around her shoulders, her expression unreadable. The guard retreated, leaving them alone in the tastefully appointed prison. You shouldn't be here. If people see you visiting me while I'm under arrest, it'll damage your reputation. My reputation was damaged the moment I married you. A little more scandal won't make much difference. She crossed to the window where he stood and looked out at the same gardens. They existed in silence for a long moment, two people who'd shared a name but never really shared a life, trying to figure out if redemption was possible or if some damage ran too deep for repair. I confronted Edmund. I heard. He denied everything, called you a liar, said you'd manufactured the evidence because you couldn't stand losing me to a better man. What did you say? That if he was a better man, he wouldn't need to destroy you to win me. That love built on someone else's ruin isn't love at all. It's just another form of conquest. And then I walked out before I could hear whatever excuses he'd prepared. Cassian felt something dangerous bloom in his chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. You believe me? I had the evidence authenticated. Every document, every letter, it's all real. Edmund has been working with your enemies since before I left you, which means his entire courtship was strategic positioning. He never wanted me. He wanted to hurt you. I'm sorry. Stop apologizing for other people's cruelty. She turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I came here because I need to know something, and I need you to answer honestly, even if the truth destroys whatever fragile thing we've been building. Anything. If you survive this trial, if you somehow prove your innocence and keep your title and your estates, will you go back to being the man you were? Will you decide that trying to change was a mistake made during a moment of weakness? Because I can't watch you become that person again, Cassian. I'd rather mourn you now than watch you transform back into the Duke who destroyed me. He took her hands, feeling the chill of winter on her skin. I can't promise I'll be perfect. I can't swear I'll never make mistakes or revert to old habits when I'm stressed or afraid. But I can promise that the man I was before you left is gone. He died the moment I watched you fold your clothes and realized power meant nothing if I lost you. What I'm becoming might not be worthy of you yet, but it's honest. And I'd rather be honestly flawed than pretend to be perfect while crushing everyone around me. She searched his face for lies and apparently found none. Then fight. Fight for your innocence. Fight to keep everything you've built. And when you win, because somehow I believe you will, fight just as hard to stay the man you're becoming instead of retreating into the safety of being feared. What changed? Yesterday you left looking like you needed distance. Today, you're here telling me to fight. Yesterday I was processing betrayal. Today I'm choosing what kind of person I want to be, and apparently, I'm the kind of person who stands beside someone trying to change instead of abandoning them the moment it gets complicated. God help me. I might actually love you, Cassian, not the Duke, not the Empire, just the broken man trying to figure out how to be human. The confession hit him harder than any accusation of treason. I love you too. I think I have for years, but I was too afraid to admit it, because love felt like giving someone the power to destroy me. And I was right to be afraid, because you do have that power. You could leave right now, and I'd survive the trial, and keep my title, and spend the rest of my life knowing I'd lost the only thing that actually mattered. Then it's fortunate I'm not leaving. She kissed him then, soft and tentative, like she was testing whether this new version of them could survive contact. Cassian kissed her back with every ounce of desperate hope he'd been suppressing for weeks, tasting salt from her tears and feeling something fundamental shift in his chest. When they finally pulled apart, Evelyn was smiling. Crying too, but smiling through it. Win your trial, Duke Ashford. Prove to the world you're not a traitor, and then come find me and we'll figure out if we can build something real from the ashes of what we destroyed. What if I lose? Then I'll visit you in exile and we'll build something real there instead. Either way, you're not getting rid of me again. She left before the guards could ask questions about why the Duchess was visiting her estranged husband in the middle of the night. Cassian watched her disappear into darkness and felt something he hadn't felt since childhood. Actual, genuine hope that didn't come with calculations attached. The trial began on a Monday morning cold enough to freeze ambition solid. Cassian stood before a panel of lords who'd spent years resenting his power, facing accusations crafted to look damning even to unbiased observers. Lord Brennan testified with rehearsed sincerity about Cassian's supposed treasonous proposals. The Crown's prosecutors presented financial records that painted a picture of systematic theft disguised as legitimate business. And through it all, Cassian's lawyers worked methodically to dismantle the case piece by piece. They brought in shipping merchants who testified to the legitimacy of Cassian's contracts. They produced correspondence proving the deals had been conducted openly with royal oversight. They demonstrated that the accounting irregularities existed only when viewed through the deliberately distorted lens Brennan's conspiracy had created. But the killing blow came from an unexpected source. Evelyn appeared as a witness for the defense, her testimony devastating in its simplicity. She explained how Edmund Thorne had courted her with suspiciously perfect timing, how he'd asked questions about Cassian's business dealings disguised as concern for her welfare, how he'd poisoned her against her husband while positioning himself as her savior. And she presented her own evidence, letters Edmund had written that revealed far more about his strategic thinking than he'd intended. The prosecution tried to discredit her as a spurned wife seeking revenge. But Evelyn's quiet dignity and obvious reluctance to destroy Edmund's reputation made her testimony devastating precisely because it was so measured. She wasn't attacking, she was simply telling the truth and letting the jury draw their own conclusions. The trial lasted 6 days. The verdict took 3 hours of deliberation. Not guilty on all charges. Cassian stood as the judgment was read and felt the weight of potential ruin lift from his shoulders. But the victory tasted hollow because he understood what it cost. His reputation was shattered. Half the aristocracy believed he'd escaped conviction through legal manipulation rather than actual innocence. His business empire was damaged, possibly beyond repair. And Edmund Thorne and Lord Brennan, despite their conspiracy being exposed, faced no real consequences because proving they'd orchestrated the false accusations would require another trial that nobody had appetite for. Justice, it turned out, was less satisfying than revenge would have been. Cassian returned to Blackthorne Manor a free man and a broken duke. The estates were his, but the power that came with them had evaporated. Allies had abandoned him. Business partners had severed ties. He was still nobility by title, but he'd been stripped of the fear and influence that made that title matter. He stood in his study staring out at snow-covered grounds and realized he'd lost everything he'd spent 30 years building. The empire was gone. The reputation was destroyed. All that remained was the man underneath, stripped of armor and artifice, forced to figure out who he actually was when power couldn't define him. Marcus found him there as evening fell. "Your Grace, the Duchess is here to see you. Send her up." Evelyn appeared in the doorway wearing traveling clothes, her hair braided simply, her expression cautious. She looked around the study, taking in the half-empty bookshelves and the portraits of dead Ashfords, judging them from the walls. "You won, barely, and at a cost that might have been higher than losing would have been." "Is it, though?" She crossed to stand beside him at the window. "You're free. Your title is intact. You can rebuild." "Rebuild what? An empire nobody fears anymore? A reputation that's been shredded beyond repair?" "I'm still Duke of Blackthorne, but the name doesn't carry weight. It used to." "Good." He turned to look at her, confusion evident on his face. "Good? You needed to lose the empire to find yourself. Power was your armor, Cassian. As long as you had it, you'd never be vulnerable enough to actually change. Now you have nothing left to hide behind. Just you, standing in an empty manor, trying to figure out who you are when control isn't an option." The observation cut deep because it was true. He'd built everything on the foundation of being feared, and now that foundation was gone. What remained was just a man who'd destroyed his own life through cruelty and pride, finally forced to become something different because the old version had burned to ash. "What do I do now?" "You start over. Not as the Duke of Blackthorne who crushes anyone who challenges him, but as Cassian Ashford who's trying to figure out how to be human. You rebuild relationships instead of empires. You learn to value people over power. And you decide whether you want me beside you for that journey or if I'm too much of a reminder of everything you lost." Evelyn stood silhouetted against the winter twilight, and Cassian understood with brutal clarity that this was the point of no return. He could retreat into bitterness and blame, could spend the rest of his life resenting the people who'd destroyed his empire, could become a harder, colder version of what he'd been, trading redemption for revenge. Or he could step into the terrifying unknown of actually changing, of building a life based on love instead of fear, of becoming someone worthy of the woman offering him a chance he absolutely didn't deserve. He reached for her hand. "I want you beside me. Not because you make losing everything easier, but because you're the only thing that makes it worthwhile. Then stay different, Cassian. Stay the man who's trying instead of the Duke who's given up. And maybe, if we're both brave enough, we can build something real from all this ruin." Outside the window, snow began falling again, covering Blackthorne Manor in white that made everything look new and clean and full of terrible, fragile possibility. Winter gave way to spring with the slow inevitability of wounds healing badly. Cassian spent those months learning to exist as something other than the Duke of Blackthorne, who crushed opposition through sheer force of will. The transformation felt like breaking bones to reset them properly, painful and necessary, and utterly without guarantee of success. He rebuilt relationships with servants he'd terrorized for years, asking their names and actually listening when they spoke. He attended parliament sessions and voted his conscience instead of his advantage, watching former allies treat him like a leper while his enemies circled closer. And he courted Evelyn with the desperate focus of a man who understood he was one mistake away from losing everything that actually mattered. She moved back into Blackthorne Manor in early March, not into the Duchess's chambers, but into a guest wing she claimed as her own territory. The symbolism was clear. They were rebuilding from scratch, two strangers learning each other properly, instead of two people trapped in a marriage built on obligation and fear. Some nights they had dinner together and talked until the candles burned low. Other nights they existed in separate wings, processing their individual damage in silence. It was messy and uncertain and nothing like the cold efficiency Cassian had once believed marriage should be. But it was real in a way their previous arrangement never was, and Cassian clung to that reality like a drowning man clutching driftwood. The attack came on a Tuesday morning when spring rain turned the estate grounds to mud. Cassian was reviewing what remained of his business holdings with Marcus when a courier arrived soaked and wild-eyed, carrying a message sealed with Edmund Thorne's family crest. Your Grace, this came by urgent dispatch. The courier says Lord Thorne demands immediate response. Cassian broke the seal and read words designed to detonate whatever fragile peace he'd been building. The letter was an invitation to a gathering at Thorne Manor, presented with all the civilized language aristocrats used when they meant to draw blood. Edmund was hosting a masquerade ball in 2 weeks, and attendance was mandatory for anyone who wanted to maintain standing in high society. The guest list included every lord and lady who'd witnessed Cassian's trial, every politician who'd abandoned him during the accusations, every business partner who'd severed ties when his reputation collapsed. And at the bottom, written in Edmund's precise script, was the real message beneath the polite invitation. The Duchess is specifically invited as my honored guest. I trust she'll attend regardless of her current living arrangements. After all, society is eager to see whether she's truly reconciled with the man who destroyed her, or if she's simply biding time until a better option presents itself. The provocation was surgical in its precision. Edmund was forcing Evelyn to choose publicly between the husband who'd betrayed her and the suitor who'd pretended to save her. If she attended as Cassian's wife, Edmund would spend the evening demonstrating what she'd given up by choosing damaged goods over a gentleman. If she attended independently or refused to go at all, society would interpret it as proof that her return to Blackthorne Manor was temporary theater rather than genuine reconciliation. Marcus read over his shoulder and swore quietly. He's baiting you, trying to provoke you into doing something that proves you haven't actually changed. Cassian crumpled the letter and threw it into the fire. Then he's going to be disappointed because I'm not taking the bait. You're not going to respond. I'm going to accept his invitation, attend his ball, dance with my wife while he watches, and prove that the Duke of Blackthorne doesn't need power or fear to walk into a room full of enemies and come out standing. That's either remarkably brave or catastrophically stupid. Ask me afterward which one it was. He found Evelyn in the library, curled up in the same chair where he'd once caught her reading and left without a word because acknowledging her presence felt like admitting she mattered. Now he sat across from her and explained Edmund's invitation with the careful honesty that had become their new language. She listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she set her book aside and met his gaze directly. He wants me to humiliate you publicly, to show society that you're weak and broken and unworthy of loyalty. Probably. He also wants to prove that you made a mistake coming back here, that you should have chosen him when you had the chance. And if I don't attend, then we let him control the narrative. Let him convince society that you're too ashamed of our reconciliation to defend it in public. I won't force you to go, Evelyn. This is your choice completely. But if you decide to attend, I need you to know that I'll be beside you regardless of what happens. What if he has something planned? Another attack disguised as entertainment? Then we handle it together. The old Cassian would have sent spies to discover Edmund's plans and countered them preemptively. But I'm trying to trust that we're strong enough to face whatever comes without needing absolute control over every variable. She studied him like she was measuring the distance between promise and reality. You've changed. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough that I can see the difference between who you were and who you're becoming. Is that enough? Ask me after the ball. If we survive Edmund's games with our dignity intact, maybe it will be. The 2 weeks before the masquerade passed in careful preparation. Cassian had no empire left to marshal and no fear to weaponize, so he fell back on the only resources remaining to him: honesty, dignity, and the desperate hope that love might be stronger than the political machinations of bitter men seeking revenge. He commissioned a gown for Evelyn that matched her eyes, storm gray with silver threading that caught light like rain. Not because he was trying to buy her affection, but because he wanted her to feel beautiful, walking into a room full of people who'd whispered about her humiliation for years. She accepted the gift with tears in her eyes and a kiss that tasted like forgiveness, still being negotiated. The night of the ball arrived with ominous timing. Storm clouds gathered over Thorne Manor as carriages lined the drive, disgorging aristocrats in elaborate masks and expensive clothing. Cassian and Evelyn arrived unfashionably late, a calculated choice that ensured every eye would track their entrance. They stood at the top of the grand staircase overlooking a ballroom that had gone silent the moment they appeared. Cassian wore black without ornamentation, his mask a simple design that didn't hide his identity so much as acknowledged the theater of the evening. Evelyn stood beside him in storm-colored silk, her mask decorated with silver stars, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Edmund waited at the bottom of the stairs, resplendent in burgundy velvet and a gold mask that made him look like an emperor holding court. He smiled with the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. "Your Grace, Duchess, how delightful that you could join us. I was beginning to worry you'd lost your nerve." Cassian descended the stairs with Evelyn, moving through the crowd that parted before them like water around stone. We wouldn't miss an opportunity to remind society that some bonds survive even the most determined efforts to destroy them. How poetic. Edmund's smile sharpened. Though I wonder if the Duchess shares your optimism. After all, she spent months considering alternatives before returning to her gilded cage. Evelyn's grip on Cassian's arm tightened fractionally, but her voice remained steady. I returned because I choose to be here, Lord Thorne. Not because I'm trapped, but because I've finally found something worth staying for. The exchange drew murmurs from the watching aristocrats. Edmund's expression flickered with something ugly before smoothing back into practiced charm. Well then, let's see if that choice holds up over the course of the evening. I've prepared entertainment I think you'll find quite illuminating. He clapped his hands and servants appeared carrying champagne and elaborate hors d'oeuvres. Music began, a waltz that filled the ballroom with civilized elegance that masked the violence simmering beneath the surface. Couples took to the dance floor while Cassian and Evelyn stood surrounded by whispers and hostile stares. "Dance with me." Cassian led her onto the floor, pulling her close in a way their formal marriage had never allowed. They moved through the waltz while society watched, judging every gesture for signs of genuine affection or strategic performance. Cassian focused entirely on Evelyn, on the way her eyes reflected candlelight, on the small smile playing at her lips. "You're good at this." She sounded surprised. "I took lessons as a child. Never used them because dancing with you meant acknowledging you existed as something other than decorative furniture. And now? Now I'd dance with you every night if it meant holding you this close without armor between us." The song ended too soon. They separated to polite applause that sounded like judgment, and Edmund appeared immediately to claim Evelyn's hand for the next dance. She glanced at Cassian, a question in her eyes. He nodded permission he had no right to give, watching as Edmund led his wife onto the floor with possessive confidence. Lord Brennan materialized beside Cassian, his expression smug beneath an elaborate peacock mask. "Quite the gathering, wouldn't you say? All your former allies. All the people who abandoned you when your empire collapsed. Edmund certainly knows how to twist the knife." Cassian kept his eyes on Evelyn, watching her maintain careful distance from Edmund despite his attempts to pull her closer. "If he's trying to humiliate me, he'll have to do better than inviting people I no longer care about impressing. Oh, I think he has more planned than simple humiliation." Brennan's smile turned vicious. You see, Edmund has been quite busy these past months, gathering evidence, building alliances, preparing to finish what we started with the treason accusations. The trial ended with my acquittal. The trial ended with reasonable doubt, not proof of innocence. Very different things in the court of public opinion. And Edmund has new evidence that paints your business dealings in an even more damaging light. Evidence he plans to reveal tonight in front of everyone who matters. Cassian felt cold certainty settle in his chest. This entire ball was a trap designed to destroy whatever remained of his reputation while forcing Evelyn to watch him be gutted publicly. Edmund hadn't invited them to reconcile or forgive. He'd invited them to witness the final annihilation of the Duke of Blackthorne's legacy. The music ended. Edmund led Evelyn off the dance floor, his hand lingering too long on her waist. She pulled away and returned to Cassian's side, her expression troubled. Something's wrong. Edmund kept asking strange questions about your business records, about shipping manifests and contract dates, like he was confirming information rather than making conversation. Before Cassian could respond, Edmund climbed onto a small stage at the end of the ballroom. He raised his hands for silence and the crowd obliged, sensing blood in the water. My friends, thank you for joining me this evening. I know many of you came out of curiosity about the Duke and Duchess of Blackthorne's recent reconciliation. Society loves a redemption story, after all. A powerful man brought low by his own cruelty, trying desperately to win back the woman he destroyed. Very romantic. Laughter rippled through the crowd, cruel and anticipatory. Evelyn's hand found Cassian's, squeezing tight. But I'm afraid I have information that complicates our romantic narrative. Edmund produced a leather portfolio from behind the podium. You see, I've spent considerable time investigating the Duke's business practices, and I've discovered something quite disturbing. During his trial for treason, certain shipping records were conveniently destroyed. Records that would have proven his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. That's a lie. Cassian's voice cut through the ballroom like a blade. Those records were reviewed by Crown investigators and found to be legitimate. Were they? Or were they simply incomplete? Edmund opened the portfolio and began reading. According to manifests I've obtained from foreign ports, the Duke of Blackthorne diverted 3 royal shipments to private warehouses in the months before his arrest. The cargo was resold at significant profit, while the Crown believed the shipments had been lost to storms or pirates. Murmurs of shock and outrage filled the ballroom. Cassian felt the crowd turn against him like a physical force, felt years of resentment and fear crystallize into certainty that he'd always been the monster they suspected. Those manifests are forgeries. He kept his voice steady despite rage burning through his veins. You fabricated evidence to support accusations that were already proven false. Have I? Edmund smiled like a predator scenting victory. Then perhaps you can explain why these manifests match warehouse receipts signed by your own accountant, the same accountant who testified against you during your trial before conveniently disappearing. He distributed copies of the documents to the crowd. Aristocrats passed them around, reading with growing horror and vindication. This was what they'd wanted all along, proof that the Duke of Blackthorne was exactly as corrupt and cruel as they'd always believed. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice ringing clear across the ballroom. Those documents prove nothing except that you're willing to lie to destroy someone you can't defeat honestly. My dear Duchess, I'm not the one on trial here. Edmund's expression was pure poisoned sympathy. I'm simply a concerned citizen bringing criminal behavior to light. The fact that doing so exposes your husband as the traitor he's always been is unfortunate but necessary. You're a coward and a liar. Evelyn's anger was magnificent and terrible. You courted me not because you cared about me, but because you wanted to use me as a weapon against Cassian. And when that didn't work, when I chose to return to my husband despite his flaws, you manufactured this entire evening to destroy us both. I gave you a chance at happiness with a man who would have treated you properly. You chose to crawl back to someone who crushed your spirit for 4 years. Don't blame me for pointing out that your reconciliation is built on lies and desperation. The crowd was riveted, watching the confrontation like spectators at a gladiator match. Cassian understood what Edmund had orchestrated. Not just public humiliation, but complete social annihilation. If these accusations gained traction, Cassian would face another trial with evidence that looked damning regardless of its authenticity. His title would be stripped, his estate seized, and Evelyn would be left tied to a convicted criminal, her own reputation destroyed by association. The old Cassian would have fought back with every weapon in his arsenal, would have destroyed Edmund so completely that his family name would be synonymous with ruin for generations. But that version of himself had burned away during months of learning to be human instead of feared, and what remained was something Edmund hadn't anticipated. A man with absolutely nothing left to lose, and therefore nothing left to fear. Cassian stepped onto the stage beside Edmund, his presence commanding even without the empire that used to enforce it. You want to destroy me? Fine. You want to drag my name through another trial and convince society I'm a criminal? Go ahead. But you made one critical mistake in your careful planning, and what's that? You assumed I still care about power, that losing my reputation and title would break me the way losing my wife almost did. But I already lost the empire, Edmund. It's gone. What remains is just a man trying to be worthy of the woman he destroyed, and that man doesn't need society's approval or Parliament's respect to know he's finally becoming something better than what he was. The ballroom had gone silent, every eye fixed on the confrontation. Edmund's confidence flickered. So publish your forged manifests. Drag me through another trial. Convince everyone here that I'm guilty of crimes I didn't commit. It won't change the fact that Evelyn chose to return to me. Won't change the fact that we're building something real from the ashes of what I destroyed. And it won't change the fundamental truth that you lost the moment she walked back into Blackthorne Manor and chose imperfect redemption over your perfect lies. Edmund's mask of civility cracked completely. You arrogant bastard. You think love conquers all? You think being slightly less terrible to your wife erases 4 years of systematic cruelty? She'll leave you the moment she realizes you're still the same controlling monster wearing a thin disguise of redemption. Then let her leave. Cassian turned to face Evelyn, speaking to her directly while the ballroom witnessed every word. I won't trap you with manipulation or guilt. Won't use these accusations as leverage to keep you beside me out of misplaced loyalty. If you want to walk away right now, I'll sign separation papers tomorrow and disappear from your life forever. But if you stay, know that I'll spend whatever time we have proving that change is possible, even for bastards like me, who spent decades believing power was the only thing worth having. The choice was hers completely, offered in front of hundreds of witnesses who'd spent years watching their marriage collapse. Cassian stood on the stage and waited while his heart hammered against his ribs, and every instinct screamed at him to control the outcome through force or manipulation. But he'd learned something during his months of carefully rebuilding what he'd destroyed. Real strength wasn't crushing opposition. It was standing vulnerable before someone you loved and trusting them not to use that vulnerability as a weapon. Evelyn climbed onto the stage beside him, her storm-colored gown shimmering in candlelight. She took his hand in front of the entire aristocracy and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. I spent 4 years married to a man I didn't recognize, living in a palace that felt like a tomb. And when I finally found the courage to leave, I thought freedom meant escaping forever. But real freedom isn't running from damage. It's choosing who you want to become despite it. So yes, I'm staying. Not because Cassian is perfect or because our marriage is fixed, but because I've finally found someone worth fighting for instead of running from. The ballroom erupted in chaos. Some aristocrats applauded, moved by the raw honesty of her declaration. Others shouted accusations, convinced this was theater designed to manipulate sympathy. Edmund stood frozen on the stage, his carefully orchestrated trap turned inside out by the simple fact that love built on honest vulnerability was stronger than his manufactured evidence. But Edmund wasn't finished. His expression shifted from shock to fury to something darker and more desperate. If words won't convince you, perhaps actions will. He pulled a pistol from inside his coat, the weapon gleaming dull in the candlelight. The ballroom went silent except for gasps of horror. Cassian stepped in front of Evelyn instinctively, his body blocking hers. Edmund's hand trembled, but his voice remained steady. You took everything from me, Ashford. My reputation, my chance with Evelyn, my family's standing in society. All of it destroyed because you couldn't accept that she deserved better than a tyrant who treated her like property. I accepted it. Cassian kept his voice calm despite his heart trying to hammer through his ribs. I accepted that she deserved better, which is why I spent months trying to become better. You're the one who can't accept that she made her own choice, a choice based on lies and manipulation. You convinced her you changed, but you're still the same controlling bastard who destroyed her in the first place. and I won't let her make the mistake of trusting you again." The pistol was aimed at Cassian's chest. He could see Edmund's finger tightening on the trigger, could see the desperation in his eyes of a man who'd built his entire identity on being the hero and couldn't survive the revelation that he was just another villain wearing different clothes. Time seemed to slow. Cassian thought about his father drinking himself to death after losing the woman he loved. Thought about spending 30 years building walls to prevent that same destruction. Thought about Evelyn folding clothes with quiet dignity while he stood paralyzed by the realization he was losing the only thing that actually mattered. And he thought about the choice he had right now in this moment with a gun pointed at his heart and the woman he loved standing behind him. He could try to disarm Edmund, could use the old instincts and training that had made him dangerous before he became powerful. Might succeed, might die trying. But either way, he'd be choosing violence and control instead of trust and vulnerability. So he did something that would have been unthinkable for the old Duke of Blackthorne. He stepped aside, moving away from Evelyn instead of shielding her, giving her clear line of sight to Edmund and the weapon aimed at them both. Edmund's eyes widened in confusion. "What are you doing? Trusting my wife to make her own choices? If she wants to run, she can run. If she wants to talk you down, she can try. But I'm done making decisions for her based on my fear of losing control." Evelyn moved to stand beside Cassian, rather than behind him, facing Edmund directly. "Put the gun down. This isn't who you want to be." "You don't know who I want to be." Edmund's voice cracked with desperation. "You never knew me at all. You were too busy mourning your broken marriage to see that I was offering you everything you deserved. You were offering me a fantasy, a noble suitor who'd rescue me from the villain. But real life doesn't work that way, Edmund. People are complicated, change is messy, and love doesn't fit into neat categories of hero and monster. So you choose him, the man who destroyed you, over me. I choose the truth over comfortable lies. And the truth is that Cassian hurt me terribly, but he's trying to become better. You pretended to be perfect while secretly trying to destroy us both. Which one of those is actually worth building a life around?" The pistol wavered. Edmund's mask was fully gone now, revealing a man who'd convinced himself that love justified any method and couldn't cope with the reality that manipulation disguised as rescue was still just manipulation. "I loved you." "No, you loved the idea of saving me. There's a difference." The gun dropped slowly. Edmund's hand shook so badly the weapon nearly fell before he deliberately set it on the stage floor. Around them, the ballroom remained frozen, aristocrats watching a confrontation that had transcended scandal into something raw and more honest than most of them had witnessed in their carefully curated lives. Guards appeared, summoned by servants during the chaos. They surrounded Edmund with careful efficiency, removing him from the stage while he stood unresisting. As they led him toward the doors, he looked back at Evelyn one final time. "I really did want to make you happy. I know, that's what makes this so sad." He disappeared into the rain-soaked night. The ballroom slowly came back to life, whispers rising like tide, aristocrats processing what they'd just witnessed. Some looked at Cassian with new respect, others with disgust that he'd provoked such violence. Most simply looked confused by a situation that didn't fit their understanding of how power and marriage were supposed to work. Cassian and Evelyn stood together on the stage, still holding hands, both of them shaking with adrenaline and relief and the terrible knowledge of how close they'd come to losing everything. Lord Brennan pushed through the crowd, his expression carefully neutral. "Your Grace, I believe I owe you an apology." Edmund's behavior tonight cast considerable doubt on the evidence he presented. The Crown will want to review those manifests more carefully. Do whatever you need to do. Cassian's voice was steady despite the chaos in his chest. "I'm done fighting to prove my innocence to people who've already decided I'm guilty. If the Crown wants another trial, I'll attend and let the evidence speak for itself. But I won't spend my life trying to convince society I've changed when the only person whose opinion actually matters is standing right beside me." Brennan nodded slowly and retreated into the crowd. Other aristocrats approached with varying degrees of sympathy and judgment. Cassian fielded their questions and comments with weary grace, while Evelyn remained pressed against his side, her presence the only thing keeping him anchored. Eventually, the crowd thinned. The ball continued around them, but the energy had shifted, become something uncertain and strange. Cassian led Evelyn off the stage and through the ballroom toward the exit, walking past portraits of Thorn ancestors who seemed to judge them from gilded frames. They reached their carriage as rain began falling in earnest. Cassian helped Evelyn inside and climbed in after her, pulling the door closed against the storm. They sat in silence while the driver guided horses through mud and darkness, heading back toward Blackthorne Manor and whatever uncertain future waited there. Evelyn leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, her breathing slowly steadying. "You stepped aside." "What?" "When Edmund pointed the gun at you. You stepped aside instead of shielding me. Why?" "Because protecting you by taking away your choices is just another form of control. I trusted you to handle the situation however you thought best, even if that meant risking both of us. That was either the bravest or stupidest thing you've ever done. Ask me tomorrow which one it was." She laughed, the sound breaking tension that had been building for hours. They rode through rain and darkness while storm clouds broke apart overhead, revealing stars that had been hiding behind the weather. Blackthorne Manor appeared ahead, its windows blazing with light that made the estate look almost welcoming. The carriage stopped. They climbed out into rain that had gentled to mist. Cassian stood looking up at the manor he'd inherited and nearly destroyed through his own arrogance and fear. "What happens now?" Evelyn took his hand, her fingers cold and sure. "Now we go inside. We face whatever consequences come from tonight. And we keep building something real from all this ruin, one honest choice at a time." They walked toward the manor together while behind them the storm rolled away across dark fields, leaving clear skies and the promise that morning always came. Eventually, even after the longest nights, especially for people brave enough to stand vulnerable before each other and trust that love built on honest truth was stronger than empires built on fear. But as they reached the door, Marcus appeared from inside, his expression grave and urgent in a way that made Cassian's instincts scream warning. "Your Grace, you need to see this. Now." He handed Cassian a letter sealed with the crown's official insignia, the wax still warm as though it had just been delivered. Cassian broke the seal and read words that turned victory into ash. The crown had reviewed Edmund's evidence despite his arrest, had found enough irregularities to warrant not just another investigation, but immediate seizure of all Ashford properties pending a full audit. Effective sunrise tomorrow, Blackthorne Manor and every estate attached to the duchy would be placed under crown control. Cassian and Evelyn had until dawn to vacate the premises or face arrest for obstruction. He read the letter twice while rain dripped from his hair, and his wife stood beside him, and everything he'd been trying to rebuild crumbled into dust around them. Not because Edmund had won, but because the crown had decided that clearing the Duke of Blackthorne's name was less important than appearing decisive against aristocratic corruption, and Cassian had become the convenient sacrifice required to maintain that appearance. Evelyn read over his shoulder, her breath catching. "They're taking everything except each other." He looked down at her, this woman who'd survived his worst and chosen to stay anyway, and felt something shift inside him that had nothing to do with power, and everything to do with finally understanding what actually mattered when the empire burned and only truth remained. "We have until dawn. Let's make it count." They walked into Blackthorne Manor together while behind them, the crown's guards were already assembling to enforce the seizure at first light, and ahead of them the final battle waited, not against external enemies, but against their own damaged pasts, and the terrible question of whether love built on honest vulnerability could survive when absolutely everything else was stripped away. They had until dawn, which meant roughly 6 hours to pack whatever mattered from a life built on the false foundation of believing power could substitute for purpose. Cassian stood in the entrance hall of Blackthorne Manor watching servants move with quiet efficiency, gathering possessions that suddenly felt meaningless. Portraits of dead Ashford stared down from walls they'd soon belong to the crown, their painted eyes judging him for being the duke who finally lost everything they'd spent generations accumulating. He felt their disapproval like weight on his shoulders and realized he didn't care anymore what ghosts thought about his failures. Evelyn appeared at the top of the grand staircase carrying a single trunk, her expression calm in a way that reminded him of the morning she'd left him. Except this time she was descending toward him instead of away, and that difference felt more valuable than all the estates the crown was seizing. "Is that everything you want to keep?" She set the trunk down and looked around the manor with eyes that had seen too much pain echo through these halls. "From this place?" "Yes. The rest is just furniture and expensive decoration. Things your ancestors collected to prove they mattered. I don't need any of it. What about your books? Your piano? Books can be replaced. The piano was beautiful, but it was never really mine. Nothing in this manor was mine, Cassian. It all belonged to the duchy, to the empire, to the legacy of men who believed accumulating possessions made them immortal. I'm taking clothes and a few small things that actually mean something. Everything else can burn for all I care. Marcus appeared carrying ledgers and financial documents, his weathered face creased with concern. Your Grace, we need to discuss where you'll go. The Crown has frozen your accounts pending the audit. You have perhaps £300 in cash reserves that weren't tied to the duchy holdings. That's not enough to maintain even a modest lifestyle for more than a few months. Cassian took the ledgers and threw them into the fireplace, watching pages curl and blacken as decades of careful accounting dissolved into ash. Then we'll learn to live on £300. People manage it every day. Your Grace, you're being irrational. You have friends who would extend credit, business partners who owe you favors. If you just reached out, no. He cut Marcus off gently but firmly. I'm done trading on the Ashford name, done calling in favors and manipulating circumstances to maintain comfort. I didn't earn. If we're starting over, we're starting from nothing. Real nothing, not aristocratic nothing, where you still have connections and influence to cushion the fall. Marcus looked between Cassian and Evelyn like he was watching people he'd served for decades transform into strangers. You've truly lost your mind. Maybe. Or maybe I'm finally thinking clearly for the first time in 30 years. Either way, this is happening. You're welcome to come with us or stay and find new employment with whoever the Crown appoints to manage the estates. No judgment either way. The old steward's eyes went wet. I've served the Ashford family since before you were born. Watched you grow from an angry child into a powerful duke. Watched you destroy yourself through pride and fear. And now I'm watching you walk away from everything like it never mattered at all. Of course I'm coming with you, you stubborn bastard. Someone needs to make sure you don't starve to death out of misplaced principle. Cassian felt something crack in his chest that had nothing to do with loss and everything to do with realizing loyalty could survive even the complete destruction of the system it was built on. Thank you, Marcus. Don't thank me yet. Wait until you're sleeping in a boarding house and eating stale bread for breakfast. Then we'll see if gratitude survives poverty. They worked through the night, sorting through 3 decades of accumulated possessions and reducing them to what could fit in a single carriage. Cassian found himself holding objects that had once seemed essential and now felt absurd. A solid gold letter opener, a jeweled snuff box, a first edition book he'd never read but kept because it was expensive. All of it went into crates for the Crown's auditors to catalog and sell. What he kept could have fit in his pockets. His mother's wedding ring, retrieved from storage where it had sat since his father's death. A small painting of the estate gardens in summer that Evelyn had commissioned during their first year of marriage, and a letter his father had written him the night before he died, full of warnings about how power would destroy him if he let it become more important than people. He'd read that letter once at age 12 and never looked at it again, because acknowledging his father's wisdom meant admitting love could be both real and fatal. Now he read it by candlelight in the empty study and understood what the old man had been trying to say. Power wasn't protection. It was just another addiction that numbed you to actual feeling until you woke up alone and wondered why everything you'd built felt hollow. Evelyn found him there as false dawn began graying the windows. You're reading his letter. First time in 18 years. Turns out he knew exactly what would happen to me if I kept choosing empire over everything else. I just wasn't ready to hear it until I'd already proven him right. What does it say? That love requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires courage, and courage requires accepting that some things matter more than safety. He was trying to tell me that being hurt is the price of being human, and running from that pain just makes you something less than alive. She sat beside him on the leather couch where he'd spent countless nights drinking alone. Your father sounds like he was wiser than you gave him credit for. He was broken by losing my mother, spent 6 months drinking himself to death because he couldn't survive without her. I watched it happen and swore I'd never let anyone matter that much. And now I understand that he wasn't weak for loving her so deeply. He was strong enough to risk everything for something real, and when he lost it, he didn't pretend the pain was manageable. He just felt it completely until it killed him. I'm not sure if that's tragic or honest, but it's definitely more human than spending 30 years hiding behind power because you're too afraid to feel anything. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Crown guards were assembling outside, preparing to take possession at first light. Marcus appeared in the doorway. Your Grace, the carriage is loaded. We should leave before the official seizure begins. Save yourself the indignity of being escorted off your own property. Cassian stood and offered Evelyn his hand. She took it, and they walked together through Blackthorne Manor one final time. Down the grand staircase where they'd posed for wedding portraits that captured nothing real. Through the dining room where they'd eaten hundreds of silent meals. Past the library where he'd destroyed her trust by kissing Margot while his wife slept upstairs. Every room held ghosts of who they'd been when power mattered more than honesty. They reached the front doors as sunrise began painting the horizon gold and rose. The Crown's representatives stood in formation on the drive, official and implacable. Lord Brennan was among them, his expression carefully neutral. Your Grace, the Duchess, I'm afraid I must ask you to vacate the premises immediately. Cassian handed him a keyring heavy with metal. The manor is yours. Try not to destroy it more than I already did. Brennan took the keys with something almost like regret on his face. For what it's worth, I believe the Crown is being unnecessarily harsh. The evidence Edmund provided was circumstantial at best. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you helped him fabricate it. The observation landed like a slap. Brennan's face went red, but he said nothing, just stepped aside to let them pass. Cassian and Evelyn climbed into the carriage where Marcus waited with their meager possessions. The driver, one of the few servants who'd chosen to follow them into uncertainty, snapped the reins. They rolled down the long drive while Blackthorne Manor receded behind them, its windows catching sunrise and throwing light across grounds that would soon belong to someone else. Cassian looked back once, memorizing the estate he'd inherited and lost, then turned forward and didn't look again. Where to, Your Grace? Marcus's question hung in the morning air. Cassian had no answer prepared because planning required knowing what you wanted to build, and he was still learning to want things that didn't involve domination or control. Evelyn spoke before he could. Somewhere small, somewhere nobody knows who we are or what we've lost. Somewhere we can figure out who we want to become without the weight of legacy crushing us. The driver nodded and turned the carriage toward the main road leading away from aristocratic estates and political intrigue. They rode through countryside waking to spring, past farms and small villages where people worked without caring about duchies or power games. The world felt larger from the window of a carriage heading nowhere particular, as though losing everything had somehow expanded the available space instead of contracting it. They stopped at midday in a town too small to have a name anyone outside the county would recognize. The inn was clean but simple, offering rooms by the week for prices Cassian had once spent on single bottles of wine. Marcus negotiated lodging while Cassian and Evelyn stood in the courtyard surrounded by their few belongings. A woman passed carrying a basket of bread, her children trailing behind her laughing about something only they understood. She glanced at Cassian and Evelyn with mild curiosity before continuing on, completely unaware she was looking at the Duke and Duchess of Blackthorne, or former Duke and Duchess. Whatever they were, now that titles had been stripped and estates seized. How does it feel? Evelyn's question caught him off guard. How does what feel? Being nobody. Standing in a town where your name doesn't carry weight and your reputation doesn't matter, where you're just another stranger passing through instead of the Duke of Blackthorne, who everyone feared. Cassian thought about it while watching the woman and her children disappear around a corner. Terrifying. Liberating. Both at the same time. I spent my whole life being someone everyone knew or feared, and I never once asked if that person was worth being. And now? Now I get to figure out who I actually am when power isn't available to define me. Might turn out I'm nobody interesting, but at least nobody interesting is honest. Marcus secured them 2 rooms on the inn's second floor. Cassian and Evelyn took the larger one while Marcus claimed the smaller. They unpacked what little they'd brought and tried to make sense of suddenly having nowhere to be and nothing expected of them. That first week passed in strange adjustment to irrelevance. Cassian woke without servants bringing breakfast or Marcus arriving with urgent correspondence. He walked through the town and nobody bowed or moved aside for his passage. He was just another face in the morning crowd, anonymous and ordinary, and slowly learning that ordinary felt less like failure than he'd always believed. Evelyn found work teaching piano to local children, her noble background translating into skills that had value even without a duchy attached. She came home in the evenings talking about her students with genuine warmth, describing their progress like it mattered more than any political alliance Cassian had ever negotiated. He watched her rediscover joy in small accomplishments and realized he was seeing who she'd been before marriage to him had crushed that lightness out of existence. He tried finding work himself and discovered that being Duke of Blackthorne had prepared him for exactly nothing useful in actual economy. He couldn't farm, couldn't build, couldn't perform any trade that required skill developed through practice rather than inherited through title. What he could do was read and write and calculate figures, so he ended up working as a clerk for a merchant who needed someone to manage ledgers and correspondence. The merchant, a shrewd woman named Margaret, who'd built her business from nothing, looked at Cassian's references and laughed. "Says here you managed shipping contracts worth thousands. Now you're applying to track my inventory of fabric and grain for £2 a week. Times change. I need work. You need someone who won't steal from you or make mistakes that cost you money. Whether I used to be somebody important doesn't matter if I can't pay rent." She hired him on the spot, more amused than convinced, and put him to work in a back room organizing chaos that previous clerks had created through laziness and incompetence. Cassian spent his days elbow-deep in ledgers, tracking shipments of wool and wheat, writing letters to suppliers in neat script that nobody would recognize as belonging to former nobility. It was humbling and tedious and somehow more satisfying than most of what he'd done as Duke. 3 months passed. Spring turned to summer. Cassian and Evelyn fell into rhythms that felt nothing like their previous marriage and everything like building something real from honest foundation. They had dinner together every evening, actual conversation instead of silence. They walked through town after supper, holding hands like young people courting instead of aristocrats performing obligation. They shared the same bed, not out of duty, but because sleeping beside each other felt safer than sleeping alone. And slowly, carefully, they learned to forgive themselves for all the ways they'd failed each other when power had mattered more than partnership. Marcus adapted to irrelevance with surprising grace. He found work managing the inn, using decades of experience running Blackthorne Manor to transform the establishment from barely functional to genuinely welcoming. Travelers started requesting rooms specifically because word spread about the quality of service, and the innkeeper credited Marcus's influence with saving his struggling business. One evening in late July, Cassian came home from the merchant's office to find Evelyn sitting at their small table with a letter bearing the crown's seal. His heart jumped with old fear that they'd come to arrest him after all, that the audit had found some new evidence of crimes he hadn't committed. "What is it?" She handed him the letter without speaking. He read official language that took 3 paragraphs to communicate simple facts. The Crown's investigation had concluded. Edmund Thorne's evidence had been thoroughly debunked as fabricated. The charges of treason were formally dismissed with apologies for the inconvenience. And in recognition of injustice done to the Duke of Blackthorne, the Crown was prepared to restore his title and estates effective immediately. The letter concluded with instructions for where to sign documents accepting reinstatement and reclaiming everything that had been seized. Cassian read it twice while his hands trembled with something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite dread. They're giving it all back. Yes, the duchy, the estates, the title, everything I lost, everything you lost. He set the letter down carefully, like it might explode if handled roughly. "What do you want to do?" Evelyn met his eyes across the small table in their modest room that cost less per month than a single dinner at Blackthorne Manor used to cost. "What do you want to do?" The question hit harder than any accusation. 6 months ago, Cassian would have jumped at the chance to reclaim power and status. Would have signed the documents immediately and returned to being Duke of Blackthorne without hesitation. But 6 months of living as nobody particular had taught him things that power never could. That worth wasn't measured in estates controlled or enemies crushed. That love required vulnerability more than it required luxury. That being human meant accepting smallness instead of constantly grasping for greatness that left you hollow. "I want to tear this letter up and forget it arrived." Evelyn's eyes went wide. "You want to refuse reinstatement?" "I want to keep being the person I'm becoming instead of going back to being who I was. The duchy didn't make me happy, Evelyn. It made me powerful and feared and completely alone except for a wife I treated like furniture. I don't want that life back, even if the crown is offering it with apologies. But it's your legacy, your family's heritage, everything your ancestors built. My ancestors built an empire on fear and accumulation, and it made them all miserable. My father drank himself to death. My grandfather died estranged from his children. Every Ashford for 3 generations sacrificed actual happiness for the appearance of power. I don't want to be the next name on that list of men who confuse domination with purpose. So what do you want? This. You. Work that doesn't require crushing people to feel valuable. A life small enough to be real instead of so grand it's just performance. I want to wake up beside you without servants hovering. Want to eat dinner and talk about our day instead of calculating which alliance needs reinforcement. Want to matter to the people immediately around me instead of being feared by hundreds who don't actually know me at all. She reached across the table and took his hands, her fingers warm and calloused from piano teaching instead of soft from idleness. That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me. Then let me say one more honest thing. If you want to go back, if you miss being Duchess of Blackthorne and having status and luxury, I'll sign those papers and we'll return to the manor and rebuild the empire. But I'll do it as a different person than I was, and I'll make damn sure our marriage is real this time, instead of just decorative. Your choice completely. I don't want to go back. The words came fast and certain. I hated being Duchess of Blackthorne, hated the politics and the performance, and the constant awareness that I was just another possession in your collection. This life we have now? It's small and uncertain, but it's ours. We built it together without servants or wealth, or anything except deciding we mattered to each other. I won't trade that for all the estates in England. Cassian felt something inside him that had been clenched tight for 30 years finally release. Then we don't go back. Just like that? You can just refuse? I can do whatever I want. I'm not Duke of Blackthorne anymore. I'm just Cassian Ashford, who works as a clerk and loves a woman too good for him and is slowly learning to be human instead of feared. If the crown wants to give the duchy to someone else, they're welcome to it. He walked to the small fireplace and threw the letter into dying embers, watching official seals and royal signatures curl black. Evelyn joined him, her arm sliding around his waist as they watched their old life burn. No regrets? Ask me in 10 years when we're still living in modest rooms and struggling to pay rent. Then I'll tell you if I regret choosing real over grand. She kissed him like they had all the time in the world instead of just borrowed moments in a life that could collapse again any second. When they separated, Cassian could taste salt from tears he wasn't sure belonged to her or him. What do we do now? Now we keep living, keep building something that doesn't require power or fear to sustain. Keep figuring out who we are when titles don't define us. That sounds terrifying. It sounds like being alive. They stood by the fire in their small room, while outside the window summer evening painted the town in gold. Somewhere distant, Blackthorne Manor sat empty and waiting for its next duke, its halls echoing with ghosts of men who'd believed accumulation meant immortality. Somewhere in London, the Crown was processing refusal documents and trying to understand why anyone would turn down restoration of title and wealth. But in this room, in this moment, none of that mattered more than 2 people who'd destroyed each other, learning to build something honest from the ruins. Marcus found them there an hour later. Your Grace, He stopped, correcting himself. Cassian. Evelyn. The innkeeper is asking if you'll be staying another month. Should I tell him yes? Tell him we'll be staying indefinitely. This is home now. The old steward's face did something complicated. Pride and sorrow and acceptance all mixed together. Your father would be proud of you. Not for the empire you built, but for having the courage to walk away from it when you finally understood what actually mattered. I'm not sure courage is the right word. Feels more like survival. Sometimes they're the same thing. He left them alone. Cassian and Evelyn moved to the window overlooking the quiet street where evening was settling in. A few people passed below, heading home from work or meeting friends for dinner. Normal people living normal lives without any awareness that former aristocrats were watching from above, learning to be ordinary. Evelyn leaned her head on his shoulder. Tell me something true. What do you want to know? Why you really refused reinstatement. The real reason underneath all the noble talk about choosing small over grand. Cassian thought about it while watching darkness creep across the town. Because going back means risking becoming who I was again. And I can't survive being that person anymore, Evelyn. The Duke who crushed everyone around him? He's dead. Died the morning you folded your clothes and walked away. What remains is just this fragile thing trying to figure out how to be worthy of love instead of settling for being feared. And that thing is too new and uncertain to survive the weight of empire pressing down on it. What if you could go back and stay different? Maybe I could. Maybe I'm strong enough now to maintain change even with power available. But I don't want to risk it. Don't want to test whether my transformation can survive the same circumstances that created the monster in the first place. Easier to stay here where temptation doesn't exist and build something completely new. That makes you sound afraid. I am afraid. Terrified, actually. Afraid of failing you again. Afraid of discovering I haven't changed as much as I think. Afraid of waking up 5 years from now and realizing I've slowly reverted to being the cruel bastard who destroyed you the first time. Staying here, living small, choosing ordinary over grand. It's the only way I know to protect us both from who I used to be. She turned in his arms to face him directly. Then we stay. We build our small life and protect what we have and let the empire crumble without us. And maybe someday we'll tell our children about how their father was once Duke of Blackthorne, but gave it all up because he loved their mother more than he loved power. Children. The word hit him sideways. We haven't talked about children. We haven't talked about a lot of things. Haven't had time between surviving Edmund's attack and losing everything to the crown. But we have time now, Cassian. All the time in the world to figure out what we want to build together. He kissed her forehead, breathing in the scent of her hair and the reality of her presence. I want to build a family. Want to raise children who never learn to equate worth with domination. Want to grow old with you in modest comfort instead of dying alone in a palace built from fear. Then that's what we'll do. They stayed at the window until full dark had settled, watching their new town prepare for night. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang 9 times. Someone laughed in the street below. Life continued its ordinary rhythms without caring that former aristocrats were standing above, learning to love smallness. The next morning, Cassian woke before dawn and dressed quietly to avoid disturbing Evelyn. He walked through empty streets to the merchant's office and arrived early enough that Margaret hadn't yet unlocked the doors. He waited on the steps, watching sunrise paint the buildings gold. She arrived 20 minutes later, keys jangling, her expression shifting to surprise when she saw him. "You're keen this morning. Wanted to ask you something before the day starts." "Go on then. I need to tell you something about who I used to be. Something I should have mentioned when you hired me." He explained his past in clinical detail. The duchy, the trial, the empire he'd built and lost. Everything he'd hidden behind vague references to previous work in shipping. Margaret listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she unlocked the office and gestured for him to follow her inside. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because living honestly means not hiding who I was, even when revealing it might cost me the life I'm building. You hired me thinking I was nobody particular. Turns out I'm somebody who used to matter and chose to walk away. Thought you deserved to know before deciding whether you still want me managing your ledgers." Margaret poured herself tea from a kettle kept warm on the stove. "Do you steal?" "No." "Do you lie to cover mistakes?" "Not anymore." "Are you good at the work I'm paying you for?" "Yes." "Then I don't care if you used to be the King of France. You're a decent clerk who shows up on time and doesn't complain about tedious tasks. That's worth more than whatever titles you've lost." Cassian felt tension he'd been carrying release. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just keep doing the work. And maybe stop acting like your past defines your present. What you were doesn't matter half as much as who you're choosing to become." She was right, he realized. The past was just context. What mattered was the daily choice to be different, to build something honest from whatever materials remained after everything else burned away. He worked through that day, and the next, and the one after, falling into rhythms that felt nothing like ruling and everything like living. Weeks became months. Summer faded into autumn. The town prepared for winter while Cassian and Evelyn prepared for their first anniversary of living as ordinary people. On a cold November evening, they hosted dinner in their small room. Marcus joined them, along with Margaret and a few of Evelyn's piano students and their parents. The gathering was cramped and informal, nothing like the grand banquets Blackthorne Manor used to host. But the laughter was real, and the conversation was genuine, and nobody was calculating advantage or playing political games. Midway through dinner, someone knocked on the door. Cassian answered to find a courier holding a letter sealed with Lord Harrow's crest. Letter for the former Duchess of Blackthorne. Urgent, apparently. Evelyn took the letter with trembling hands. Her father had been distant since their refusal of reinstatement, disappointed that his daughter had chosen modest poverty over restored nobility. She opened it carefully and read while the room fell silent. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. My father is dying. Cancer. The doctors give him maybe 2 months. Cassian moved to her side immediately. When do we leave? Tomorrow, if we can arrange travel. She looked around at the gathering, at the life they'd built from nothing. I'm sorry to cut this short. The guests left with quiet condolences. Marcus helped arrange a coach, while Cassian and Evelyn packed for a journey neither wanted to make. They left at dawn, riding through winter landscape toward Lord Harrow's estate, and whatever reconciliation or judgment waited there. The journey took 3 days. They arrived to find the estate diminished, several buildings showing neglect, grounds overgrown with weeds. Evelyn's father had apparently struggled financially after Cassian's fall, unable to maintain appearances without the Ashford alliance supporting him. A servant showed them to Lord Harrow's chambers. The old man lay in bed looking gray and shrunken, mortality eating him from inside, but his eyes sharpened when Evelyn entered. You came. Of course I came. You're my father. I wasn't sure you'd want to see the man who pushed you into marriage with a monster. Cassian felt the barb hit home, but Evelyn squeezed his hand. You didn't push me anywhere. I chose to marry Cassian, and I chose to leave him when he became someone I couldn't recognize. And I chose to return when he started becoming someone worth knowing. All my choices, Father. You don't get to take credit or blame for any of it. Lord Harrow's gaze shifted to Cassian. You really refused reinstatement. We really refused. Why? You could have had everything back, the title, the estates, all the power you spent your life building. Because power is just another word for lonely when you use it to avoid being human. I spent 30 years building an empire, and it made me miserable. Spent 6 months living as nobody particular, and it's the most alive I've felt since childhood. The choice wasn't difficult once I stopped confusing greatness with happiness. The old man absorbed this while struggling to breathe. I spent my whole life chasing status. Married your mother because her family had connections I needed. Married my daughter to you because the Ashford alliance elevated our standing. Never once asked if any of it made me happy. Just assumed that mattering to important people was the same as mattering at all. And now? Now I'm dying in a house I can't afford to maintain. Surrounded by servants I can't pay, clinging to a title that means nothing because I have no heir to pass it to. Everything I sacrificed happiness for turned out to be temporary. But love? That's permanent. Your mother died 20 years ago, and I still wake up missing her. Evelyn is the only thing I did right in my entire life, and I nearly destroyed her by pushing her towards someone as damaged as I was. He reached for Evelyn's hand with fingers that shook. I'm sorry. For pressuring you into marriage. For not protecting you when your husband turned cruel. For judging you when you chose to return to him. You deserved a father who put your happiness above his ambition. Evelyn was crying openly now. You did your best with what you understood. That's all anyone can do. They stayed for 3 weeks while Lord Harrow faded. Cassian helped settle the estate's finances using skills developed during his months as a clerk to organize chaos into manageable debt. He negotiated with creditors and found buyers for property that had to be sold. Not as the Duke of Blackthorne leveraging power, but as someone who understood how to make numbers work. Lord Harrow died on a gray December morning with Evelyn holding his hand and Cassian standing quiet witness. They buried him in the family plot beside his wife, under stones that would weather and fade until nobody remembered who they'd been or what they'd thought mattered. After the funeral, Evelyn inherited what little remained, a small cottage on the edge of the property, a modest annuity that would pay basic expenses, and her father's final letter apologizing for everything he'd done wrong and thanking her for becoming someone better than he'd ever managed. They stood in the cottage looking at simple rooms that needed work. Evelyn walked through touching walls like she was saying goodbye to childhood. What do you want to do with it? Sell it. Use the money to help Marcus expand the inn. He's been talking about buying the building next door and adding more rooms. This would give him enough capital to actually do it. You'd give away your inheritance? It's not giving away. It's investing in someone who's been loyal through everything. Besides, we don't need a cottage in the country. We have a home in town and work we care about, and each other. That's enough. They sold the cottage and settled the estate's remaining debts. Evelyn kept only her mother's jewelry and a few books her father had loved. Everything else went to creditors or to Marcus's expansion fund. By the time they returned to their small town, winter had settled in completely. The inn looked different. Marcus had already started renovations, adding rooms and improving common areas. He greeted them at the door looking younger than he had in years. The expansion is ahead of schedule. We'll be ready to accommodate twice as many guests by spring. Your contribution made the difference between dreaming and doing. Consider it payment for 3 decades of service. Cassian clapped the old steward on the shoulder. Though I think you're the one doing me a favor by letting me invest in something real instead of another empire built on fear. They settled back into routine. Cassian returned to the merchant's office, where Margaret greeted him with a raise and more responsibility. Evelyn expanded her piano teaching, taking on students from neighboring towns. Their life continued its small rhythms, ordinary and honest, and somehow more meaningful than anything grand they'd built before. Spring arrived with unexpected news. Evelyn was pregnant. They sat together in their room, processing the reality of new life growing inside her. Cassian felt terror and joy mixed together until he couldn't separate them. Are you scared? Terrified. What if I'm a terrible father? What if I repeat the mistakes my father made? What if I teach our child all the wrong lessons about power and worth? Then you'll make mistakes and learn from them and try to do better. Same as everyone else. She placed his hand on her stomach where nothing was visible yet, but everything was changing. Our child won't grow up in Blackthorne Manor learning to equate worth with domination. They'll grow up here learning that family matters more than empire. That's already better than what you had. The pregnancy progressed through summer. Evelyn taught piano until her students started asking when the baby was due. Margaret gave Cassian more flexible hours so he could help Evelyn as she grew larger and more uncomfortable. Marcus built a cradle from oak, simple and sturdy, refusing payment because family took care of family. Their daughter arrived on a September evening during the first cold snap of autumn. Labor was long and difficult, but Evelyn endured it with the same quiet strength she'd shown folding clothes years ago. When the midwife finally placed the baby in Cassian's arms, he looked down at this tiny person who'd never known him as Duke of Blackthorne and felt something break open in his chest. She has your eyes. Evelyn's voice was exhausted but joyful. Poor child, doomed to look stern even when she's happy. What should we name her? They'd discussed names for months without deciding. But holding his daughter while Evelyn recovered from bringing her into the world, Cassian knew exactly what she should be called. Hope. We'll name her Hope because she represents everything we're building instead of everything we lost. Hope Ashford. Evelyn smiled. Perfect. They brought their daughter home to their small room above the inn and learned to be parents without servants or wet nurses. Cassian changed diapers and walked the floor at midnight and discovered that exhaustion from caring for a child felt completely different from exhaustion from managing an empire. This was purposeful, real, the kind of tired that came from love instead of obligation. The town embraced them and their daughter. Margaret gave Evelyn months off work with pay, insisting that family came first. Students sent gifts and offered to help. The innkeeper's wife taught them tricks for soothing crying babies. They existed in a web of community that Blackthorne Manor's isolation had never allowed. Hope grew from infant to toddler. Cassian taught her to walk in the inn's courtyard while other guests watched and offered encouragement. Evelyn taught her to sing simple songs while Marcus made faces to keep her entertained. She was loved by people who knew her parents as clerk and piano teacher instead of duke and duchess. On Hope's second birthday, they held a small party in the inn's common room. The gathering included Margaret and her family, several of Evelyn's students, neighbors who'd become friends, and Marcus who'd become something closer to grandfather. Someone brought cake. Someone else brought toys carved from wood. Hope laughed and played while adults talked about ordinary concerns like weather and crops and the merchant ship that had arrived in port. Cassian stood watching his daughter and realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd thought about Blackthorne Manor or the empire he'd lost. That life felt distant and unreal, like something that had happened to someone else. What felt real was this: his daughter playing with toys made by neighbors, his wife laughing with friends who knew her as Evelyn instead of Duchess, his own identity as father and husband and clerk who showed up on time and did honest work. Evelyn joined him at the edge of the celebration. Happy? Deliriously. Terrifyingly. Both at once. Good. That means you're alive instead of just powerful. She was right. Being alive meant feeling everything, joy and fear and love and uncertainty, all mixed together. Being powerful had meant feeling nothing except the cold satisfaction of control. He'd traded empire for existence and discovered that existence was infinitely more valuable. That evening, after guests left and Hope was sleeping, Cassian and Evelyn sat at their window watching their town prepare for night. 2 years since they'd refused reinstatement. 3 years since she'd walked away from Blackthorne Manor. 4 years since he'd realized too late that power meant nothing if you lost the person who actually mattered. "Do you ever regret it?" Evelyn asked quietly, turning down everything the crown offered. "Every time I can't afford something Hope wants. Every time I see you wearing a dress you've mended because we can't afford new. Every time I calculate our finances and realize we're one disaster away from genuine poverty instead of just modest comfort. That's not an answer. No regrets. Not one. I'd rather struggle to provide for our family as someone real than live in luxury as the hollow thing I used to be. What we have is small and uncertain, but it's ours. We built it together without servants or wealth or anything except deciding we mattered to each other. That's worth more than all the estates in England." She leaned against him, fitting perfectly into the space beside his heart. Good answer. Years passed in quiet accumulation of ordinary moments. Hope grew into a bright child who asked endless questions and showed no interest in nobility or power. She wanted to know how birds flew and why rain fell, and whether the moon was really made of cheese like Marcus jokingly claimed. Cassian answered her questions as best he could, and discovered that teaching his daughter about the world mattered more than any political alliance he'd ever negotiated. Margaret eventually made him a partner in her merchant business, recognizing that his organizational skills and careful accounting had expanded her operations significantly. The partnership came with profit sharing that lifted them from modest poverty into genuine middle-class comfort. Not wealthy by aristocratic standards, but secure enough that unexpected expenses didn't threaten their survival. Evelyn's piano teaching flourished. She took on advanced students and began composing her own music, simple pieces that captured the ordinary beauty she'd always loved. Gardens in twilight, windows with rain, quiet moments before they disappeared. Her compositions sold to music publishers in London, bringing in money and modest recognition that had nothing to do with being Duchess of Blackthorne. Marcus expanded the inn until it became the finest accommodation in the region. He hired staff and trained them with the same exacting standards he'd used at Blackthorne Manor, except now the purpose was hospitality instead of intimidation. Travelers came from distant cities specifically to stay at his inn, drawn by reputation for quality and warmth. They built comfortable lives from nothing. Not grand, not powerful, just real and honest and full of the small connections that made existence worthwhile. One winter evening, when Hope was 7, Cassian came home from the merchant's office to find Evelyn reading a letter at their table. The room was larger now, a proper apartment they'd rented once finances allowed, with space for Hope to play and windows that let in good light. "What is it?" She handed him the letter. It bore the new Duke of Blackthorne's seal, someone the crown had appointed after Cassian's refusal. The message was brief and formal. The current Duke had discovered portraits in the manor's storage, paintings of Cassian and Evelyn from their wedding, from various formal events, from moments captured by artists paid to document aristocratic life. He was offering to return them in case they held sentimental value. Cassian read the letter twice. "Do you want them?" Evelyn looked at Hope playing with wooden toys Marcus had carved. "Do those portraits show who we actually were, or who we were pretending to be?" "Pretending, mostly. The Duchess performing duty, the Duke maintaining appearance. Neither of us was real in any of those paintings." "Then let them stay at Blackthorne Manor. Let them be artifacts of people who used to exist. We're different now. Those portraits wouldn't fit our life even if we wanted them." He wrote a polite refusal and sent it the next morning. Let the past stay in the past where it belonged, What mattered was the present and the future they were building, one honest choice at a time. Years continued their steady accumulation. Hope grew into a remarkable young woman who showed no interest in reclaiming nobility her parents had abandoned. She wanted to be a musician like her mother, composing pieces that captured ordinary beauty instead of grand drama. Cassian and Evelyn supported her completely, proud of a daughter who understood that worth came from passion instead of position. On their 20th anniversary of living as ordinary people, Cassian and Evelyn returned to the town where they'd first arrived with nothing. The inn was now a landmark, Marcus having built it into an institution. The merchant business was thriving, Margaret having retired and left Cassian to manage operations. Their daughter was studying music in London, writing letters full of excitement about compositions and performances. They stood at the same window where they'd watched their first sunset as nobody particular. The town had grown and changed, but remained fundamentally the same. A place where ordinary people lived ordinary lives without caring about duchies or empires. 20 years. Evelyn spoke quietly. 20 years since we walked away from everything. Any regrets? Not one. Every struggle, every moment of uncertainty, every time we couldn't afford something we wanted. Worth it to have this instead of returning to who we were. Cassian pulled her close and looked out at the town that had become home. Somewhere distant, Blackthorne Manor still stood, occupied by a duke who'd never know what it felt like to lose everything and discover that losing everything was the only way to find what actually mattered. But here, in this modest apartment above a merchant's office, in this town full of people who knew him as Cassian instead of Your Grace, he'd found something no empire could provide. Purpose. Connection. Love that didn't require power to sustain it. He'd learned too late that power meant nothing if you lost the person who mattered. But having learned that lesson, he'd made damn sure never to forget it again. And standing at the window with Evelyn beside him and their daughter thriving in the world, and years of honest living behind them, Cassian Ashford understood something his ancestors never had. Real strength wasn't crushing everyone around you. It was having the courage to be vulnerable with someone and trusting they wouldn't use it against you. Real power wasn't accumulation. It was choosing what mattered and protecting it with everything you had. Real worth wasn't measured in estates controlled or enemies defeated. It was measured in small moments of genuine connection that no title could purchase and no empire could replace. He'd been Duke of Blackthorne once, powerful and feared and absolutely alone except for a wife he'd destroyed through casual cruelty. Now he was just Cassian, husband, father, merchant, friend, someone who mattered to the people immediately around him instead of being feared by hundreds who didn't know him at all. The trade was everything for something smaller but infinitely more real, and he'd make that same choice every single time if given the chance. Because some women don't scream when their hearts break. They simply pack their suitcase and walk away forever, leaving behind nothing but the ghost of warmth in a palace built entirely from ice. And some men are lucky enough to learn from that loss before it destroys them completely, choosing to build something honest from the ruins instead of retreating into the comfort of being feared. Outside the window, evening painted the town in gold. Inside, Cassian held the woman he'd almost lost and felt gratitude for every single ordinary moment that had brought them here. He'd learned his lesson, finally, completely. Too late to save the empire, but just in time to save his soul, and that, he decided, was worth more than all the power in the world.